The day I brought my newborn son home from the hospital, my incision was still bleeding through my bandages. Instead of balloons or warm congratulations, my in-laws were waiting in our living room like a firing squad. My father-in-law crossed his arms and coldly stated, "We are not putting our last name on a child that might not be his." My mother-in-law smiled a venomous smile, sliding a post-nuptial agreement across the glass coffee table and telling me to pack my things. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply pulled a sealed envelope from my diaper bag and handed it to my husband. "Read the lab report out loud," I told him. He read one single line, the color draining from his face, and looked at his mother in absolute horror. "I am Abigail, 33 years old and a forensic accountant. Before I reveal the secret that destroyed their perfect family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who severely underestimated your intelligence." The pain radiating through my abdomen was sharp and relentless as I stepped out of the hired car and looked up at the towering brick facade of the Weston Estate in Massachusetts. I was carrying my son Leo, wrapped tightly in a soft blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling with quiet breaths. I had spent the last 4 days in a sterile hospital bed, recovering from an emergency surgery entirely alone. My husband Carter had left the hospital shortly after I was rolled into the recovery room, muttering something about a family crisis. I assumed he had gone to prepare the house for our baby. I assumed he was being a partner. I assumed completely wrong. I pushed open the heavy oak front door, expecting the warm glow of the entryway lights. Instead, the house felt like a tomb. The air conditioning was turned down so low it made me shiver. I limped into the formal living room, clutching Leo to my chest, and stopped dead in my tracks. There was no welcome home banner. There was no joy. Standing in a rigid line in front of the marble fireplace were my father-in-law Richard, my mother-in-law Patricia, and my husband Carter. Carter was staring at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He would not even look in my direction. Richard stepped forward. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, always dressed in tailored suits, his posture projecting an arrogant certainty that he owned everything and everyone around him. He did not look at his newborn grandson. He looked at me with undisguised disgust. "We are not putting the Weston name on a bastard," Richard said, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceiling. "We know exactly what kind of game you are playing, Abigail, and it ends today. You are nothing but a gold digger." I stood frozen, the physical pain in my stomach momentarily eclipsed by the sheer shock of his words. A bastard. I looked at Carter, waiting for him to step up to defend his wife and his days-old child. But Carter just shifted his weight, keeping his eyes glued to the expensive Persian rug. "Carter," I said, my voice trembling from a mix of exhaustion and rising anger. "Tell me what is going on. Tell your father he is out of his mind." Before Carter could utter a single syllable, Patricia moved out from behind her husband. She had always hated me. From the moment Carter introduced us 3 years ago, she made it her personal mission to remind me that I did not belong in their elite circle. Now she was practically vibrating with triumph. She walked to the glass coffee table and slapped down a thick stack of legal documents. "Did you really think a mid-level forensic accountant could trap a Weston heir with a stray mutt?" Patricia sneered, her perfectly manicured finger tapping the paper. "We oppose this marriage from day one. You crawled out of the foster system with 0 pedigree, 0 family, and 0 money. You thought your pregnant belly would secure you a slice of our generational wealth. Well, your little insurance policy failed. Sign this postnuptial agreement. You waive any right to alimony, you waive any claim to the Weston estate, and you leave this house today." I looked down at the documents. They wanted to throw me out on the street with a newborn baby fresh out of major surgery. The cruelty was breathtaking. They had used my status as an orphan against me for years, whispering at country club dinners about how Carter had married a charity case. They thought because I grew up in the system I was weak. They thought because my job involved analyzing spreadsheets instead of attending charity galas I was stupid. I looked back at the man I had married. "Carter, look at me," I demanded, my voice hardening. "Are you really going to let them do this?" Are you going to deny your own son? Carter finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, but there was no strength in them. It is for the best, Abigail. Mom says it is for the best until we figure this out. Just sign the papers. The board of directors cannot have a scandal right now. I need to protect my position at the trust. He was a 35-year-old vice president of a massive investment fund, yet he was nothing more than a frightened little boy terrified of losing his mother's approval and his father's money. He chose his trust fund over his own flesh and blood. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. I did not cry. My profession required me to look past emotional manipulation and focus strictly on hard evidence. I hunted down hidden assets and exposed corporate fraud for a living. I dealt in facts, paper trails, and irrefutable proof. If they wanted to play a game of legal threats and bloodlines, I was more than ready to play. You want to talk about bloodlines, Richard? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want to talk about protecting the pure generational Weston legacy? I shifted Leo gently into my left arm, ignoring the burning sting in my lower abdomen. With my right hand, I reached into the side pocket of my diaper bag. During my pregnancy, a routine ultrasound had flagged a potential risk for a rare genetic condition. I had insisted on a comprehensive genetic panel for both Carter and me to ensure our baby would be safe. The results had been delivered to my hospital room yesterday. The medical data provided everything we needed to know about Leo's health, but the genetic markers had revealed a horrifyingly clear picture of something entirely different. I pulled out the thick, sealed hospital envelope featuring the official crest of the genetic testing laboratory. I walked forward and pressed the envelope directly against Carter's chest. I am not signing anything, I said, staring dead into my husband's cowardly eyes. Read the DNA results out loud, Carter. Read the scientific facts to your parents since they care so much about who belongs in this family. Carter swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he broke the seal. Richard and Patricia watched closely, their expressions smug, fully expecting the paper to prove my infidelity. Carter unfolded the heavy medical report. His eyes scanned the first page, dropping to the summary section at the bottom. The silence in the living room grew suffocating. Carter stopped breathing. I watched the arrogant facade completely shatter. He read the line again. He did not look at me. He did not look at Richard. Instead, Carter slowly turned his head and stared at his mother with absolute, unadulterated horror. The silence in the grand living room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Carter stared at the single sheet of paper in his hands. I knew exactly what he was reading. As a forensic accountant, I spent my career dissecting financial anomalies, hunting down the invisible threads that proved fraud. When my obstetrician warned me about a rare genetic blood disorder, I applied that same relentless scrutiny to my own family. I demanded a full genetic sequencing panel for both Carter and me. The report Carter held contained two undeniable facts. The first fact stated that baby Leo was a 100% biological match to Carter Weston. The second fact was the anomaly. The genetic markers proved without a shadow of a doubt that Carter lacked the distinct hereditary traits unique to the Weston paternal line. I watched Carter's eyes dart back and forth across the page. His jaw slacked. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He slowly raised his head, his breathing shallow and rapid. He did not look at me. He did not look at his newborn son. He locked eyes with his mother. Patricia's perfectly lifted face twitched. Her smug, victorious smile vanished, replaced instantly by naked, primal terror. She recognized the emblem of the genetic testing facility at the top of the page. She knew exactly what secret I had accidentally unearthed. 35 years ago, the matriarch of the elite Weston family had committed paternity fraud. "What is it?" Richard barked, stepping forward, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the marble floor. "Read it out loud, Carter. Tell me it proves this gold digger is a fraud. Tell me we are legally clear to throw her out on the street." Carter stood paralyzed. He was a 35-year-old vice president of the Weston Family Trust, a man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate assets, but right now, he was just a terrified little boy. If he read that paper aloud, He would validate my fidelity and claim his son, but he would also destroy his own life. He would lose his title, his inheritance, and his identity. He would expose his mother as an adulterer and strip himself of the Weston name he hid behind. Patricia lunged forward, her voice pitched artificially high. "Give that to me, Carter! Let me see what lies she forged. Let me see what this desperate little orphan cooked up to steal our wealth." She reached for the paper, but Carter snatched his hand back. His knuckles turned white. He looked at his mother silently, communicating a lifetime of panic in a single second. Then he looked at his father, the arrogant patriarch who valued pure bloodlines above human life. Finally, Carter looked at me. I saw the exact moment the coward made his choice. Carter crushed the thick medical paper into a tight ball in his fist. He deliberately shoved it deep into his trouser pocket, burying the truth. "You disgust me!" Carter spat, forcing a tone of violent rage. "You absolute tramp! You thought you could pass off another man's bastard as mine." The sheer audacity of his lie hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a tear. "Carter," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You know exactly what that paper says. Do not do this. You are looking at your biological son. Get this cheating garbage out of my house." Richard roared, his face turning a deep, furious shade of crimson. "I knew she was nothing but a parasite the moment you brought her here. She has no pedigree, no class, and no morals." Patricia snatched the postnuptial agreement from the coffee table and shoved it hard against my chest. The sharp edge of the binder dug into my collarbone. "Sign it and leave Abigail, or we will drag you through court until you have absolutely nothing left. We will make sure you cannot even afford diapers for that mutt." I let the documents fall to the floor. They scattered across the priceless rug like trash. I pulled Leo closer to my body, wrapping my arms protectively around his fragile frame. The fresh incision from my C-section burned with a blinding, searing agony, but I stood my ground. "I will not sign a single page," I stated, meeting Richard's furious glare and then Patricia's terrified eyes. "And I do not need a dime of your dirty money." Carter grabbed my upper arm. His grip was bruising, fueled by his desperate need to eliminate the threat I posed to his empire. He yanked me toward the heavy oak front doors. The man who had held my hand through a painful delivery just days ago was now physically dragging me across the foyer like a criminal. "Carter, you are making the biggest mistake of your miserable life," I warned him softly as he hauled me toward the exit. "My only mistake was marrying a poverty case." He sneered, his breath hot against my face. He threw the massive front door open. A torrential downpour greeted us. The wind howled, driving freezing rain across the porch. Lightning flashed, illuminating the manicured driveway and the heavy iron gates of the Weston estate. "Get out!" Carter yelled. He grabbed my diaper bag from the console table and hurled it out into the mud. "And do not ever come near my family again." He shoved me hard. I stumbled backward onto the wet stone porch, biting my tongue to keep from screaming as the surgical wound in my abdomen stretched painfully. I regained my balance just as the heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. The loud metallic click of the deadbolt echoed through the storm, locking me out. I stood alone in the freezing rain. The water soaked instantly through my thin sweater, chilling me to the bone. I carefully adjusted the waterproof blanket around Leo, shielding his tiny, perfect face from the harsh weather. He did not cry. He just blinked up at me with Carter's dark eyes. I looked back at the imposing brick facade of the mansion. Inside, they were likely celebrating. They thought they had won. They thought they had easily discarded a helpless woman who would quietly fade into the background, crippled by poverty and shame. They thought I would cower. They did not know that for the past 5 years, my professional curiosity had driven me to quietly map every hidden offshore account, every shell company, and every tax evasion scheme buried deep within the Weston family trust. They did not know that I held the keys to their complete financial destruction. I wiped a cold raindrop from Leo's warm cheek. A slow, sharp smile stretched across my face, cutting through the pain. Game on. The rain was still lashing against the tinted windows of the town car when I pulled up to the grand entrance of the Four Seasons. The valet rushed forward with a massive umbrella eyeing my soaked clothes and the bundle wrapped tightly in my arms. I bypassed the standard check-in desk and walked straight to the VIP concierge. A few minutes later, I was standing in the center of a $2,000 a night penthouse suite, the Boston skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I gently placed Leo in the center of the massive king-sized bed, securing him with pillows. He was asleep, completely oblivious to the fact that his father had just banished us into a hurricane. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a barrage of automated alerts from our bank. Joint checking account frozen. Platinum credit card canceled. Savings account restricted. Then came the text message from Carter. It was exactly as pathetic and predictable as the man himself. "Starve until you sign the papers," the message read. He really thought he had me cornered. He thought I was just a naive accountant who married into money and would crumble the second he cut off my allowance. I tossed the phone onto the nightstand and walked over to the leather chair in the corner. I unzipped the hidden compartment in the lining of my diaper bag. I bypassed the useless plastic Carter had just canceled and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium card. It was tied to an offshore trust I had established 4 years ago, long before Carter and I were even engaged. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that the only person who will ever truly protect you is yourself. I hunted down missing millions for massive corporations. I tracked embezzlement across international borders. Carter never bothered to ask about my success because he was too obsessed with his own last name. I ordered a bassinet, a breast pump, and $500 worth of room service, swiping the black card without a second thought. Then I pulled out my laptop, booted up my encrypted network, and dialed my private attorney, Jonathan. He answered on the first ring. "Are you safe?" he asked, his voice sharp and strictly business. "I am at the Four Seasons," I replied, typing rapidly as my financial software loaded. Carter just locked the accounts and demanded I sign the postnuptial agreement. "I assume you have a strategy ready to go." "I have the nuclear code," I told him. "You need to file an injunction against Carter for spousal abandonment and secure full physical custody of Leo immediately." Jonathan paused. "The Westons will fight you for custody just to spite you, Abigail. Richard has judges on his payroll. He will claim the baby is not a Weston and demand a court-ordered paternity test to humiliate you publicly." "I want them to demand a paternity test," I said, leaning back in the chair. "The lab report I handed Carter tonight already proves Leo is his biological son. We share a 100% parental match." I heard the rustle of paper on Jonathan's end of the line. "Then why did Carter throw you out into a storm?" "Because the genetic panel I ordered was comprehensive," I explained, keeping my voice deadpan. "It screened for hereditary diseases linking back 3 generations. The markers confirmed Leo is Carter's son, but they also confirmed a massive chromosomal gap. Carter lacks every single genetic marker specific to the Weston paternal line." There was a heavy, stunned silence on the phone. "Are you telling me that Carter Weston is not Richard Weston's biological son?" Jonathan asked, his tone shifting from professional calm to absolute shock. "I am telling you that Patricia Weston is a fraud," I replied. "She cheated on Richard 35 years ago and passed off another man's child as the sole heir to the Weston empire." Carter saw the results with his own eyes. Instead of confronting his mother, he decided to protect his billion-dollar inheritance by throwing his innocent wife and newborn son out into the street. He is covering up the biggest scandal in Boston high society to save his own skin. He thinks if he calls me a cheater first, no one will ever look at his own DNA. Jonathan let out a low whistle. "Abigail, if Richard finds out Carter is not his blood, he will decimate both Carter and Patricia. But you are caught in the crossfire right now. Richard is ruthless. He has unlimited resources, and right now he thinks you are a gold-digging cheater trying to steal from his family. If you go to war with him, he will use every dime of his empire to crush you before you can even present that lab report in a courtroom." I looked out the window at the financial district below. The Weston Financial Tower stood tall and illuminated in the distance, a massive monument to Richard's arrogance and Carter's unearned privilege. I cracked my knuckles and hovered my fingers over my keyboard. "Jonathan," I said softly, Richard thinks he has a billion-dollar empire. He thinks his wealth makes him untouchable. But he does not realize who he just kicked out of his house. I am a forensic accountant, and I have spent the last 3 years quietly reviewing the ledgers Carter carelessly leaves open on his home office desk. Let me show you what I can do to a billion-dollar empire in 5 minutes. The cold water from the scrub sink ran over Andre's hands, washing away the physical evidence of a brutal 12-hour shift. He leaned heavily against the stainless steel basin, staring at his exhausted reflection in the mirror. He had just spent half a day pulling shattered glass and twisted metal out of a young car crash victim, fighting tooth and nail to keep a stranger's heart beating. His muscles ached, his eyes burned under the harsh fluorescent lights of the surgical wing, and his mind craved nothing but silence. Instead, his phone began to vibrate violently against the metal counter. Andre glanced at the screen. Caroline. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and hit the speaker button. You need to call Carter right now and threaten him, Caroline demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of a greeting. I just walked out of the operating room, Caroline. Andre said, his voice flat, stripped of all energy. I am not calling your brother to fight your battles. What is it this time? He capped my discretionary trust allowance, she shrieked, the sound echoing harshly in the quiet locker room. He restricted my platinum card and told the wealth manager to cap me at a measly $50,000 for the entire month. 50,000, Andre. I have the country club gala next week. I have a custom fitting in Milan. How am I supposed to survive on $50,000? Andre gripped the edges of the sink. He thought of the family currently weeping in the waiting room downstairs, terrified about how they were going to afford the deductible for their son's life-saving surgery. He thought of the sheer, staggering disconnect between the woman he had married and the reality of the world he worked in every single day. You will survive, Caroline, Andre replied, keeping his tone dangerously even. You have a closet full of unworn gowns. Wear one of them. I am too tired for this. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The ugly, entitled core of the Weston family always surfaced when they were denied what they wanted. I know your family grew up clipping coupons in a tiny row house, Caroline snapped, her tone dripping with quiet venom. I know $50,000 sounds like a fortune to you, but your people just do not grasp the concept of generational wealth. I have societal obligations to maintain our image. You do not understand what it takes to protect this level of status because you were not born into it. We elevated you to this circle, Andre. The least you can do is support me when my own brother acts like a tyrant. Andre stared at his reflection, his jaw tight. The microaggressions were no longer micro. They were blatant racist reminders that no matter how many degrees he held, no matter how many lives he saved, the Westons would always view him as a charity case they had permitted to sit at their dinner table. Do not ever speak to me about my family again, Andre said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and absolute. And figure out your own allowance. I am going to my office. He ended the call before she could scream another insult. He grabbed his coat, his chest tight with a mix of suppressed rage and profound exhaustion. He walked through the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the hospital, exchanging quiet nods with the night shift nurses. He just wanted to review his post-operative charts, close his eyes for 20 minutes, and figure out how much longer he could endure a marriage built on a foundation of toxic privilege. Andre unlocked the heavy glass door to his private office and stepped inside. He dropped his coat on the chair and reached for his desk lamp. As the warm light flooded the mahogany desk, he froze. Sitting directly in the center of his keyboard, placed with deliberate precision, was a sleek, matte black USB drive. It was not his. His office had been locked. Hospital security was tight, and only a select few had access to this wing. Andre frowned, picking up the small metal device. He turned it over in his hands. There were no markings, no labels. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a strange, creeping sense of dread, he plugged the drive into the side of his secure desktop monitor. The screen flickered. A highly sophisticated decryption program launched automatically, bypassing the hospital's standard firewall with alarming speed. A black window popped up, running lines of green code before instantly snapping open into a massive, multi-tabbed spreadsheet. Andre leaned in, his brow furrowing as he read the headers. It was the complete financial ledger for the Hayes Pediatric Oncology Foundation. He had founded the charity 5 years ago. It was his life's work outside the operating room, a foundation designed to cover the staggering medical debts of families fighting childhood cancer. He poured his own salary into it, and he used his pristine reputation to solicit millions in donations from Boston's elite. Caroline and Carter had volunteered to manage the administrative side of the charity, claiming they wanted to handle the tedious financial routing so Andre could focus on medicine. He scrolled down the first page. The incoming donations were massive, millions of dollars flowing in from Gala's corporate sponsors and private benefactors. But as he clicked to the second tab labeled Discretionary Disbursements, the blood turned to ice in his veins. The numbers did not match. Andre was a surgeon, not an accountant, but the theft was so blatant, so arrogant, that it required no specialized training to understand. He traced the outgoing wire transfers. $300,000 for consulting fees, $500,000 for administrative logistics, $700,000 for international outreach. Every single outbound wire transfer was being routed into 3 obscure limited liability companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Andre pulled up the state corporate registry database on his second monitor. His fingers flew across the keys, his heart hammering against his ribs as he typed in the names of the LLCs. The search results loaded instantly. He stared at the screen, the air knocked completely out of his lungs. The registered agent for the first dummy corporation was Carter Weston. The registered agent for the other 2 was Caroline Weston Hayes. They were stealing from dying children. They were siphoning millions of dollars out of a pediatric cancer fund and washing it through shell companies to fund their lavish lifestyles, their custom Milan fittings, their imported sports cars. And they were using his name, his face, and his flawless medical license as the ultimate untouchable shield to do it. If the IRS or the FBI audited this charity, Carter and Caroline would walk away clean. Andre would be the one going to federal prison for embezzlement. A sickening wave of betrayal washed over him. His wife was not just spoiled, she was a monster. Suddenly, the massive spreadsheet on his screen vanished. The monitor went pitch black. Andre jolted backward in his chair as a single line of crisp white text typed itself across the center of the dark screen. Check your wife's garage. A. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the massive hotel suite. I sat cross-legged on the plush sofa, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my son from the king-sized bed across the room. I had just planted a digital bomb right in the center of Andre Hayes' immaculate, honorable life. It was only a matter of time before the shockwave hit the rest of the Weston family. I did not have to wait long. My phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table, the harsh buzzing shattering the quiet of the room. The caller ID flashed a name I had grown to despise over the last 3 years. Caroline Weston Hayes, Carter's older sister, the woman who treated her husband Andre like a walking ATM and treated me like something she had scraped off the bottom of her designer shoes. I picked up the phone, swiped to answer, and immediately tapped the speakerphone button, setting it back down on the table. I did not even bother saying hello. "You think you can extort my family, you little street rat?" Caroline shrieked. Her voice pitched so high it distorted through the phone speaker. Carter just called me in an absolute panic. He said you refused to sign the postnuptial agreement and actually had the audacity to steal documents from his home office. You are a delusional gold-digging parasite. Abigail and I am going to personally ruin you. I kept my eyes glued to my laptop monitor. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. Arguing with a narcissist is a waste of oxygen. Instead, I brought up a secondary command window and let her keep talking. "I am going to destroy you," Caroline continued to rant, her breathing ragged with manufactured fury. "You think you can just walk away and play the victim? I am posting to the entire Boston elite private network right now. I am telling every socialite, every CEO, and every board member in this city that you slept with your senior partner at the accounting firm. I will tell them you were caught in his office, and that the mutt you just gave birth to belongs to him." By tomorrow morning, you will be a social pariah. You will be blacklisted from every accounting firm in the state. You will be completely unemployable, and you will be begging us for a settlement just to buy formula for your bastard child." Her voice echoed through the quiet hotel suite, a torrent of vile, calculated malice. She wielded her social power like a club, fully believing that public humiliation was the ultimate weapon. But Caroline failed to realize one crucial detail. I did not care about the country club. I did not care about Boston high society. I cared about hard, undeniable data. While she screamed threats of social ruin, my fingers flew across the keyboard. I brought up the raw data files I had copied from the Weston Family Trust server before Carter threw me out into the storm. I isolated the transactions linked to the Hayes Pediatric Oncology Foundation. Caroline had always acted like a financial genius because she knew how to use a black card, but her methodology for embezzlement was laughably arrogant. She and Carter had siphoned millions in donations meant for dying children, routing the cash into 3 distinct dummy corporations. They thought placing the LLCs under offshore holding names in the Cayman Islands made them invisible. But money never truly vanishes. It leaves a footprint, a digital echo, that a trained forensic accountant can track in their sleep. I ran a trace route on the primary shell company, pulling the SWIFT codes from the outbound international wire transfers. Caroline was so confident in her untouchable status that she had not even bothered to use a secure proxy network when authorizing the payouts. I bypassed the weak encryption on the offshore account and pulled the IP address logs. I hit the enter key. The screen cascaded with raw data before snapping into a clear, undeniable list of locations. The IP address used to authorize $250,000 in stolen cancer funds matched the exact IP address of the router inside Caroline's Beacon Hill mansion. She had literally stolen from sick children while sitting on her custom velvet sofa. I tracked the destination of the stolen funds. The $250,000 had bounced from the Cayman Islands to a holding account in Delaware and then wired directly to an exclusive exotic car dealership just outside of Boston. The invoice attached to the transfer detailed the purchase of a custom-built midnight blue Porsche 911 Turbo. "You are nothing," Caroline spat through the phone, pausing only to catch her breath. "You are a nobody from the foster system, and you will go back to being a nobody. I am going to make sure my brother crushes you in court until you have absolutely nothing left." I minimized the routing logs and opened a secure encrypted browser window. I navigated directly to the official tip submission portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I attached the IP logs. I attached the bank routing numbers. I attached the invoice for the Porsche. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and finally spoke. My voice was entirely stripped of emotion, cold and hollow. "Enjoy your new Porsche, Caroline," I said quietly, cutting through her hysterical rant. The line went dead silent. The sudden absence of her screaming was deafening. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as panic replaced her arrogant fury. "I hope you know the feds monitor wire transfers over $10,000. I continued, my eyes locked on the submission button on my screen. "And I hope you know that stealing from a pediatric cancer charity carries a mandatory federal prison sentence." "Abigail, what are you talking about?" Caroline stammered, her voice suddenly dropping to a terrified, trembling whisper. "How do you know about who?" I brought my finger down hard on the enter key. The screen flashed green, confirming the anonymous tip had been successfully submitted and locked into the federal database. There was no undoing it. The avalanche had officially started. I reached over and ended the call, cutting off her panicked voice. I closed my laptop and looked over at my son, sleeping peacefully in the center of the bed. The Weston family thought they could discard us like trash. They were about to learn that I was the one holding the matches, and I was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. The crystal chandeliers of the Boston Country Club cast a harsh, glittering light over the annual Thanksgiving gala. It was the social event of the season, a room packed tight with generational wealth politicians and corporate titans. I handed my coat to the cloakroom attendant and paused just outside the grand ballroom doors. The air hummed with the clinking of crystal flutes and the low murmur of high society gossip. At the very center of the room, dominating the space near a massive ice sculpture, the Westons were holding court. Richard stood with a glass of bourbon in his hand, laughing loudly with a state senator. Carter leaned against the marble bar, looking the part of the tragic betrayed husband, accepting sympathetic pats on the back from his fellow trust fund executives. But it was Caroline and Patricia who were doing the real work. Their voices carried over the soft notes of the string quartet. "I tell you, it is an absolute tragedy," Patricia was saying to a circle of attentive wives. "Carter gave that girl everything. He rescued her from a miserable little background, and how does she repay him? By sleeping with the senior partner at her accounting firm. She is a complete sociopath," Caroline chimed in, taking a delicate sip of her red wine. "She actually tried to pass the baby off as Carter's. Can you imagine the sheer audacity? Thank God Carter demanded a paternity test. We threw her out immediately. She is probably living in a motel right now, begging for a settlement." I adjusted my grip on Leo. He was wide awake, his dark eyes blinking against the bright lights of the ballroom. I ran a hand over his soft hair, took a slow, deep breath, and stepped through the double doors. I was not wearing the modest, off-the-rack clothing Patricia used to criticize. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that cascaded flawlessly to the floor. It was a statement piece purchased directly with my offshore trust funds. Around my neck rested a heavy vintage diamond collar that caught the chandelier light with blinding brilliance. I held my head high, my posture radiating absolute control. The string quartet seemed to falter for a fraction of a second. A woman near the entrance gasped. Then the whispers began. They rippled through the sea of tuxedos and ball gowns, a wave of shock that parted the crowd. The elite of Boston stepped aside, clearing a direct path for me as I walked straight toward the center of the room. Patricia spotted me first. The smug, gossiping smile slid off her meticulously lifted face, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer outrage. She aggressively tapped Caroline on the arm. Caroline whipped around, her eyes widening in disbelief before narrowing into pure, unadulterated malice. Without a word to their audience, the two Weston women marched forward, intercepting me before I could reach the center of the ballroom. "What do you think you are doing here?" Patricia hissed, keeping her voice low but venomous, so the surrounding guests would not hear her panic. "This is a private members-only event. You are not a Weston anymore. You have no right to step foot in this building." "I am still legally married to your son," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and projecting just enough for the surrounding elite to hear every word. "And I am a member of this club independently. I paid the initiation fee myself 3 years ago from my own corporate accounts. Did Carter forget to mention that I make 3 times his base salary?" Caroline stepped forward, her face flushed a blotchy, furious red. She clutched her full glass of Merlot tightly in her manicured hand. "You have some nerve showing your face here with that bastard child." "He is Carter's biological son, Caroline," I stated, meeting her furious glare without blinking. "And you know it. The only fraud in this room is the family trying to cover up their own dirty secrets." Caroline let out a shrill, manic laugh. "You are delusional. You are a nobody from the foster system, and you will go back to being a nobody." She turned her head and shouted toward the entrance, abandoning all pretense of high society decorum. "Security! Get this trash out of here immediately. She is trespassing and harassing my family." 2 security guards in dark suits started jogging toward us from the lobby doors. The surrounding guests fell completely silent, watching the drama unfold with breathless anticipation. I stood my ground, shifting Leo slightly so he was shielded by my body. I did not break eye contact with Caroline. I said, "Get her out!" Caroline shrieked, enraged that the guards were not moving fast enough, her face twisted into an ugly primal sneer. "If they will not remove you, I will make sure you leave." She thrust her arm forward with vicious force, deliberately hurling the entire glass of dark red wine directly at me. She aimed straight for my chest, intending to drench my emerald gown and my newborn son in the dark liquid. I braced myself, turning my shoulder sharply to protect Leo from the impact. But the splash never hit us. A tall figure in a sharp charcoal gray tuxedo stepped seamlessly out of the crowd, placing himself directly between Caroline and me. The heavy splash of Merlot hit his broad back with a loud smack, soaking instantly into the expensive fabric of his jacket and splashing up against his crisp white collar. The wine dripped down his shoulder, staining the pristine fabric. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing entirely. The only sound in the massive room was the soft drip of wine hitting the polished marble floor. Dr. Andre Hayes slowly turned around. He did not flinch. He did not bother wiping the wine from his neck. The brilliant, renowned pediatric surgeon, the man Caroline treated as a disposable accessory, looked down at his wife. He had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift, saving a life only to discover his wife was stealing millions from dying children. Now he stood in front of the Boston elite covered in her thrown wine. Caroline's jaw dropped. The empty crystal glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Andre glared down at his arrogant, privileged wife. His dark eyes burned with a cold, absolute fury that made Caroline physically shrink back in terror. The shattered crystal echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. Caroline backed away, her hands trembling as she stared at the dark red stain bleeding down the front of Andre's crisp white shirt. The elite crowd of Boston held its collective breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The string quartet remained frozen, their bows hovering uselessly over their instruments. Then the heavy rhythmic thud of expensive leather shoes broke the silence. Richard Weston pushed his way through the circle of gawking socialites, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He took one look at his daughter, then at the wine soaking into his son-in-law's tuxedo, and finally locked his cold, calculating gaze onto me. He stepped in front of Caroline, shielding her with his body before turning his attention to Andre. Andre Richard demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried perfectly across the marble floor. "Step away from that woman. You are causing a scene and you are humiliating this family." Andre did not move a single muscle. He stood directly between me and the Westons, a human shield radiating pure, absolute contempt. Richard's jaw tightened. He leaned in closer, his tone shifting from authoritative to something far more insidious. He looked Andre up and down, his eyes dripping with racial microaggressions. "I suggest you remember where you are, Andre. And more importantly, remember who put you here. You were a scholarship kid from a rough neighborhood with a mountain of student debt. We gave you the clinic. We gave you the foundation. We gave you a seat at this table. Do not forget who elevated you to this society. Now step aside." The casual racist condescension in Richard's voice was sickening. It was the exact same toxic superiority Caroline had weaponized against him on the phone earlier that night. It was the ugly truth of how the Westons viewed anyone outside their bloodline as assets to be acquired, managed, and discarded. But Andre did not flinch. He did not lower his gaze. He stood his ground, his broad shoulders squared against the patriarch of the Weston Empire. "You did not elevate me to anything," Richard Andre replied, his voice deadly quiet. "My skill in the operating room earned me my place. You just bought the naming rights to stroke your own ego." I stepped out from behind Andre, balancing Leo effortlessly on my hip. The time for playing defense was over. I reached into the hidden compartment of my custom clutch and pulled out a slim black leather-bound folder. I walked right up to Caroline, who was still cowering behind her father's shoulder, trying to look like the victim. I held the folder out to her. She stared at it as if it were a live grenade. "Take it," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly through the silent ballroom. When she refused to move, I simply dropped the folder onto the marble floor at her feet. It landed with a heavy smack, flipping open to reveal a thick stack of highly encrypted bank statements, routing logs, and offshore transfer receipts. The top page was highlighted in bright yellow marker. "What is this garbage?" Patricia hissed, stepping forward to look down at the papers, her face pale with dread. "That is a detailed forensic accounting report of the Hayes Pediatric Oncology Foundation," I said, making sure my voice reached the surrounding guests, the very people who had donated millions to that charity, specifically the discretionary disbursement logs from the past 36 months. Caroline let out a strangled gasp. She finally realized what she was looking at. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly around the shattered glass, "Caroline loves to play the role of the generous philanthropist. She handles the administrative routing for her husband's charity. But she got greedy and she got incredibly sloppy. Those documents trace over $4 million in missing donations, money meant for dying children. A collective gasp erupted through the crowd. A wealthy hedge fund manager standing in the front row who I knew had written a $500,000 check to the foundation last year turned chalk white. Caroline and Carter routed those funds directly into 3 dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. I stayed locking eyes with Richard, watching his arrogant facade shatter into a million pieces. And from there, the money flowed straight back to Boston. Look at the routing numbers on page 3, Caroline. They link your offshore accounts directly to the purchase of 6 Himalayan crocodile Hermes bags and that custom midnight blue Porsche you just ordered. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You are lying. You are a bitter, scorned woman making libelous accusations to extort my family. Security arrest her for corporate espionage. Call them. I challenged him, stepping closer. Call the police right now, Richard. Let them look at the Swift codes. Let them trace the IP addresses back to the router in Caroline's living room. I turned to face the crowd, making sure my voice reached the very back of the opulent room, delivering the final devastating blow. You didn't elevate him, Richard, I said, throwing his vile words right back in his face. You used his pristine medical license to launder your dirty money. You put an honest, brilliant surgeon's name on a charity so you and your entitled children could use it as a personal piggy bank without raising suspicion. You hid behind a good man's reputation to steal from sick kids. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Guests were shouting. The hedge fund manager was furiously dialing his lawyer. Patricia was clutching her chest, looking like she might actually faint, while Caroline backed away, her hands covering her face as she realized her country club kingdom had just been completely incinerated. The social ruin she had threatened me with was now crashing down on her own head. I turned away from the wreckage of the Weston family. Andre was staring at me. The anger in his eyes had shifted into something else entirely. It was a look of profound, shocking realization. He had found the anonymous USB drive on his desk. He had seen the spreadsheet, and now he knew exactly who had put it there. He stepped over the puddle of spilled wine and shattered glass, ignoring the screaming matches erupting around him. He stopped inches from me, his eyes darting from the leather folder on the floor to the fierce, uncompromising look on my face. We need to talk, Andre said, his voice cutting through the noise. Now. The heavy brass doors of the Boston Country Club swung shut behind us, cutting off the chaotic symphony of shattering glass, shouting socialites, and Caroline's hysterical screaming. Her shrill voice still echoed faintly through the thick walls, a pathetic soundtrack to the destruction of her carefully curated kingdom. Andre did not look back. He walked with long, deliberate strides across the valet pickup lane, his posture rigid and his jaw set like stone. The freezing November air bit through my silk gown, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept the cold at bay. I held Leo securely against my chest, pulling my coat tight around his small sleeping form. My car is this way, Andre said, his voice a low, gravelly command. We drove in complete silence. The tension inside the sleek interior of his sedan was thick enough to choke on. Andre stared straight ahead at the dark, winding roads, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The dark stain of Caroline's wine was still visible on his white shirt collar, a glaring reminder of the disrespect he had endured for years. He bypassed the affluent neighborhoods and headed toward the industrial edge of the city, finally pulling into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner. It was a stark, unapologetic contrast to the crystal chandeliers and ice sculptures we had just left behind. It was secure, it was quiet, and it was entirely off the Weston family's radar. We walked into the diner and took a booth in the far back corner, shielded by high vinyl seats. The waitress dropped off 2 mugs of black coffee and retreated to the counter, leaving us completely alone in the dim, flickering neon light. Andre took a slow, deep breath and finally looked at me. His dark eyes were cold, analytical, and burning with a terrifying focus. He was not throwing a tantrum like his wife. He was not making empty threats like his father-in-law. He was a surgeon assessing a critical trauma, identifying the exact source of the bleed before making the first cut. They used my foundation. Andre stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. They used the charity I built with my own hands. I spend 12 hours a day opening the chests of dying children, trying to give desperate parents one more year, one more month, one more day. And my wife was using my medical license as a shield to steal their donations. She bought a Porsche with money meant for chemotherapy. He picked up his coffee mug, staring into the dark liquid. I should have seen it. He continued, his tone dropping an octave. Richard always insisted on handling the administrative logistics. He told me I was too valuable in the operating room to be bogged down by forensic accounting. He played the supportive father-in-law, and Caroline played the devoted philanthropist. They risked my medical license. They risked everything I stand for. If the IRS flagged those offshore accounts before you did, I would have been the one going to federal prison. The board would have crucified me, and Richard would have washed his hands of the entire mess. They never saw you as family, Andre, I said quietly, leaning across the scratched laminate table. They saw you as an asset, a pristine, untouchable reputation they could exploit. They elevated you because they needed your credibility to mask their corruption. Andre met my gaze. His eyes narrowed. You did not just pull those routing numbers to humiliate Caroline at a party, he said, correctly reading my strategy. You could have handed that file to the feds anonymously and walked away. You orchestrated that scene tonight for a reason. You wanted Richard to panic. You wanted them off balance. What is your actual play here, Abigail? I am going to dismantle the Weston Trust, I replied, my voice steady and absolute. I am going to rip their empire apart brick by brick, and I am going to leave Richard Weston with absolutely nothing. Andre did not blink. How? Carter is already moving to freeze my assets, I explained, keeping my voice low. He is going to claim infidelity and use his family's judges to tie me up in litigation for the next decade. He plans to contest Leo's paternity. The Westons own half the private medical labs in the state. If Carter submits a DNA sample, Richard will ensure the results are falsified. They will legally declare that Leo is not a Weston, cutting him completely out of the generational trust and leaving me with nothing but legal debt. I looked down at my son, who shifted softly in his carrier. I refuse to let them discard my son like collateral damage, I said, looking back up at Andre. The Weston family trust is ironclad, written by Richard's grandfather. It stipulates that the primary beneficiary must be a direct, undisputed blood descendant. Richard has used that clause to manipulate his children for decades. If I can definitively prove Leo is the sole legitimate male heir of this generation through an independent, uncorrupted federal lab, Richard cannot disinherit him without legally dismantling his own grandfather's trust and surrendering control of the board. Andre leaned back in the vinyl booth. His clinical mind processed the legal and financial ramifications instantly. You want to bypass Carter entirely, Andre deduced. You want to match the baby's DNA directly to the patriarch. Exactly, I confirmed. If I serve Richard with a federal paternity match linking him directly to his grandson Carter's manufactured infidelity claims evaporate instantly. It completely destroys their narrative, secures Leo's future, and rips the control of the trust right out of Richard's hands. But there is a problem, Andre noted sharply. Richard is paranoid. He employs private security. He does not leave fingerprints on glasses at restaurants. He shreds his disposable items. You will never get close enough to secure a viable, legally admissible DNA sample without him knowing. I know, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But you can. I reached into my clutch and retrieved a small, sealed plastic cylinder. I placed it gently on the table. I slid the sterile medical swab across the scratched laminate directly toward the surgeon. I need Richard's DNA, I said, holding Andre's intense gaze. And you are the only one who can get close enough to take it. Andre looked down at the medical swab resting under the harsh diner lights. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for time to think about it. He simply reached across the table, picked up the sealed cylinder, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his stained tuxedo jacket. Andre turned on his heel, his broad shoulders cutting a ruthless path through the paralyzed crowd of Boston's elite. He did not look back. He ignored the frantic, high-pitched shrieks of his wife echoing from the grand lobby. Caroline was screaming his name, demanding he return to her side, demanding he fix the catastrophic ruin she had brought upon herself. Her voice cracked shrill and pathetic, reverberating off the crystal chandeliers and marble columns. He pushed through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, letting them swing shut behind him, sealing her inside her crumbling kingdom. I followed a moment later, clutching the leather folder in one hand and securing Leo's carrier with the other. The freezing November air hit my face the second I stepped out onto the valet lane, but the adrenaline burning hot in my veins kept the cold at bay. The first strike was a success, but the war had only just begun. Andre was standing by his sleek black sedan, holding the passenger door open. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying focus. He did not say a single word as I secured Leo into the back seat and slid into the passenger side. He drove us away from the affluent enclaves of the city, navigating the winding roads with aggressive white-knuckled precision. The dark stain of Caroline's wine was still visible on his crisp white collar, a glaring physical reminder of the profound disrespect he had endured for years. We left the mansions and manicured lawns far behind, crossing into an industrial district where the streetlights flickered and the Weston family held absolutely no influence. He pulled into the empty, pothole-riddled parking lot of a 24-hour diner. It was a stark, unapologetic contrast to the opulence we had just left. It was gritty, isolated, and completely secure. We walked inside and chose a booth in the far back corner, shielded by high vinyl seats and obscured from the front windows. A tired waitress dropped off 2 mugs of black coffee and retreated behind the counter, leaving us entirely alone in the dim neon light. Andre did not touch his coffee. His dark eyes locked onto mine. He was not throwing a tantrum like his wife or making empty threats like his father-in-law. He was a surgeon assessing a critical trauma, identifying the exact source of the hemorrhage before making the first cut. "They used my foundation," Andre stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth. It was a chilling, absolute statement of fact. "They used the charity I built with my own hands. I spend 12 hours a day in the operating room trying to give dying children 1 more month of life. And my wife used my medical license as a shield to steal their donations. She bought luxury cars with money meant for pediatric oncology." He gripped the edge of the scratched laminate table. His knuckles turned white. "I should have seen it," he continued, his tone dropping an octave. "Richard always insisted on handling the administrative logistics. He told me I was too valuable in the operating room to be bogged down by forensic accounting. He played the supportive father-in-law, and Caroline played the devoted philanthropist. They risked my medical license. They risked everything I stand for. If the federal authorities had flagged those offshore accounts before you did, I would have been the one going to federal prison. The medical board would have crucified me, and Richard would have washed his hands of the entire mess." I leaned forward, making sure he understood the gravity of their deception. "They never saw you as family, Andre. They saw you as an asset, a pristine, untouchable reputation they could exploit. They elevated you because they needed your credibility to mask their corruption." Andre met my gaze. The anger in his eyes sharpened into a brilliant tactical blade. "You did not just pull those routing numbers to humiliate Caroline at a party," he noted, reading my strategy with flawless accuracy. "You could have handed that file to the authorities anonymously and walked away. You orchestrated that scene tonight for a specific reason. You wanted Richard to panic. You wanted them completely off balance. What is your actual play here, Abigail?" "I am going to dismantle the Weston Family Trust," I replied, keeping my voice steady and uncompromising. "I am going to rip their empire apart brick by brick, and I am going to leave Richard Weston with absolutely nothing." Andre did not blink. "How?" "Carter is already moving to freeze my assets," I explained, mapping out the inevitable counterattack. "He is going to claim infidelity and use his family's deep pockets to tie me up in litigation for the next decade. He plans to contest Leo's paternity. The Westons own or fund half the private medical labs in the state. If Carter submits a DNA sample, Richard will ensure the results are falsified. They will legally declare that Leo is not a Weston, cutting him completely out of the generational trust and leaving me with nothing but legal debt. I glanced at my son sleeping peacefully in his carrier next to me. A fierce protective instinct surged through me. I refuse to let them discard my son like collateral damage, I said, looking back at Andre. The Weston Family Trust is ironclad, written by Richard's grandfather. It explicitly stipulates that the primary beneficiary must be a direct, undisputed blood descendant. Richard has used that exact clause to manipulate and control his children for decades. If I can definitively prove Leo is the sole legitimate male heir of this generation through an independent, uncorrupted federal lab, Richard cannot disinherit him without legally dismantling his own grandfather's trust and surrendering control of the entire board. Andre leaned back against the vinyl booth. His mind processed the legal and financial ramifications instantly. You want to bypass Carter entirely, Andre deduced. You want to match the baby's DNA directly to the patriarch. Exactly, I confirmed. If I serve Richard with a federal paternity match linking him directly to his grandson Carter's manufactured infidelity claims, evaporate instantly. It completely destroys their narrative, secures Leo's future, and rips the control of the trust right out of Richard's arrogant hands. But there is a major problem, Andre stated, his voice tight. Richard is incredibly paranoid. He employs private security around the clock. He does not leave fingerprints on glasses at restaurants. He shreds his disposable items. You will never get close enough to secure a viable, legally admissible DNA sample without him knowing. I know, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But you can. I reached into my custom clutch and retrieved a small, sealed plastic cylinder. I placed it gently on the table. The harsh diner lights reflected off the clear casing. I slid the sterile medical swab across the scratched laminate directly toward the surgeon. I need Richard's DNA, I commanded, holding Andre's intense gaze. And you are the only one who can get close enough to take it. The heavy oak doors of Richard Weston's private study swung open, revealing the patriarch sitting behind his imposing desk. The room smelled of aged Scotch, expensive leather, and the suffocating arrogance that defined the entire Weston bloodline. Andre stepped across the threshold, his medical bag gripped firmly in his right hand. His face was a mask of professional clinical detachment, betraying absolutely nothing of the rage simmering just beneath the surface. Richard did not look up from the documents he was reviewing. You have a remarkable amount of nerve stepping foot in my house, Andre, especially after that pathetic little stunt you pulled at the gala. I am not here to discuss the gala. Andre replied, his voice flat and even. He walked directly toward the desk and set his medical bag down on the polished wood. Your private physician called my office this morning. He reported that your blood pressure has been spiking into the stroke zone for the past 48 hours. Since you refused to go to the clinic, he asked me to conduct a home evaluation. Richard finally looked up, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. He scoffed, leaning back in his chair. I am perfectly fine. A little elevated stress from dealing with Abigail's hysterical delusions is to be expected. Carter is handling her as we speak. By tomorrow afternoon, he will have full custody of my grandson, and she will be locked in a psychiatric facility. The Weston name will be protected. Andre felt his jaw tighten at the mention of the rigged custody suit, but he forced his muscles to relax. He opened his bag and pulled out a sphygmomanometer. Roll up your sleeve, Richard. Unless you want to risk a massive cerebral hemorrhage before you get to see Carter's victory. Grumbling about the inconvenience, Richard unbuttoned his custom-tailored cuff and shoved the sleeve up his arm. You need to get your house in order. Andre Richard lectured, his tone dripping with characteristic condescension. Caroline is upset. You humiliated her in front of our peers. I suggest you remember the lifestyle this family has afforded you. We gave you your clinic. We gave you your reputation. You are a highly paid accessory to this family, and you would do well to remember your place. Andre wrapped the cuff around Richard's bicep, pulling the heavy Velcro tight. A little tighter than necessary. He pumped the bulb, watching the gauge rise, listening to the heavy, arrogant thud of Richard's pulse through his stethoscope. The numbers were indeed dangerously high. Your systolic pressure is 180. Andre stated, removing the stethoscope from his ears. You are a walking time bomb. I need to run a stat lipid panel and check your cortisol levels. If these numbers do not stabilize, I am admitting you to the cardiac ward. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Do whatever you need to do, just make it quick. I have a conference call with the board in 10 minutes to finalize Abigail's complete financial ruin. Andre turned back to his bag, his movements smooth and practiced. He pulled out a sterile tourniquet, an alcohol prep pad, and a fresh needle. But he did not just pull out the standard clinic collection tubes. Hidden in the palm of his hand was the specialized encrypted vial Abigail had given him at the diner. He tied the rubber tourniquet around Richard's arm, his fingers working with the precise, unflinching grace of a master surgeon. He wiped the skin with the alcohol pad, the sharp antiseptic smell cutting through the heavy scent of cigar smoke. Hold still, Andre commanded. He slid the needle into the prominent vein. Dark red blood surged through the plastic tubing. Andre filled the first standard tube, then seamlessly swapped it for Abigail's specialized vial. He watched Richard's blood fill the container, a dark physical manifestation of the arrogant DNA that had terrorized so many lives. It took less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds to secure the key to destroying the Weston Empire. Andre withdrew the needle, pressing a cotton ball to the puncture site. Keep pressure on that, he instructed, his voice betraying none of the adrenaline flooding his system. He slipped the specialized vial directly into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, burying it next to his heart, while tossing the standard tube into his bag. Have the lab rush those results, Richard ordered, pulling his sleeve down. And go find your wife. Fix whatever temper tantrum you are currently throwing. Andre zipped his bag shut. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned and walked out of the study, leaving Richard to stew in his own self-importance. The grand foyer of the mansion was deadly quiet, the high vaulted ceilings echoing with the sound of Andre's dress shoes striking the marble floor. As he reached the front door, a sharp voice echoed from the top of the sweeping grand staircase. Are you finally done pouting? Andre paused, his hand resting on the heavy brass doorknob. He turned his head slowly. Caroline stood at the top of the stairs wearing a silk dressing gown. Her face was pale, her makeup smudged, but her posture was rigid with the same delusional entitlement that plagued her father. I have been waiting for you to come to your senses, Caroline sneered, descending the first few steps. That little stunt at the gala was unforgivable, Andre. You made me look like a fool. But my father said we need to project a united front right now, so I am willing to let you apologize. Come back to bed. We can discuss how you are going to fix the mess you made of my foundation. She genuinely believed she was in control. She believed that after laundering millions of dollars from dying children, she could simply demand an apology from the husband she had treated like a disposable prop. Andre looked up at her. He felt absolutely nothing. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical void. He did not yell. He did not argue. He simply turned his back on her, opened the heavy front door, and walked out into the freezing morning air. Andre, Caroline shrieked, her voice cracking as it echoed off the marble walls. Do not walk away from me. I am your wife. Get back here right now. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off her frantic demands. 40 minutes later, Andre pulled his sedan into the shadowy depths of a subterranean parking garage beneath the financial district. The concrete pillars blocked out the morning light, leaving the space illuminated only by flickering fluorescent bulbs. He cut the engine and waited. A sleek black town car idled in the corner of the garage. The passenger door opened, and Jonathan, Abigail's lead attorney, stepped out into the damp, echoing space. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his briefcase clutched securely in his hand. Jonathan was a legal predator, a man who dismantled corporate giants before breakfast. Andre stepped out of his car and met Jonathan halfway. Neither man offered a greeting. The stakes were far too high for pleasantries. Andre reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved the sealed cylinder containing Richard Weston's blood, and held it out. Is it viable? Jonathan asked, his eyes locked on the vial. Freshly drawn. Andre confirmed, his voice echoing slightly against the concrete. Untampered and pristine. Do you have the secure chain of custody established? Jonathan took the cylinder, sliding it immediately into a heavy tamper-proof federal evidence lockbox. The courier is waiting. This goes straight to an independent federal-level diagnostics laboratory in Maryland. The Westons have zero jurisdiction, zero contacts, and zero influence there. The results will be uploaded directly to a secure server, accessible only by a federal judge. Jonathan locked the metal box, the heavy click sealing the fate of the Weston family. He looked up at the surgeon, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. Carter thinks he is walking into family court tomorrow to strip Abby of her child with a forged medical document, Jonathan said, turning back toward his idling car. He has no idea what is about to hit him. When that federal judge looks at this DNA profile, it will not just prove that Leo is a legitimate heir. Jonathan paused, opening the door to his town car. It is going to completely shatter Patricia's 35-year lie. The clock is officially ticking. Jonathan's town car disappeared up the concrete ramp, carrying the biological key to the Weston Empire's destruction. Andre stood beside me in the damp, echoing garage, his posture slowly losing the rigid tension of the past hour. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face for a trace of hesitation. He found none. The medical strike was complete. Now it was time for the financial slaughter. I opened the passenger door of Andre's sedan, retrieving my heavily encrypted laptop from the floorboard. I balanced it on the hood of the car, the screen casting a pale bluish glow over the dim parking structure. "What are you doing now?" Andre asked, stepping closer to look at the cascades of routing numbers reflecting in my eyes. "Cutting off their oxygen supply," I replied, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Richard Weston believed his wealth was a fortress. Carter believed his bribes made him untouchable. Caroline believed her trust fund was an infinite magical resource that shielded her from the consequences of laundering charity money. They were all about to learn a very harsh lesson in modern federal banking regulations. Over the past 48 hours, I had compiled a master dossier. It contained the cloned offshore routing numbers, the fake LLC shell companies Richard used to hide assets, the foundation ledgers Caroline used to siphon pediatric oncology funds, and the crowning jewel, Carter's digital receipt for a $250,000 bribe to the director of Vanguard Medical Diagnostics. I did not just leak this to the press. I bypassed the local authorities entirely and routed the encrypted package directly to the severe, unforgiving algorithms of the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I attached an emergency injunction request citing immediate flight risk and ongoing mass-scale embezzlement. Federal systems do not negotiate. They do not care who your father plays golf with. When they detect a highly credible, mathematically proven pattern of multi-million-dollar fraud coupled with a federal bribe, they react with automated, devastating force. I hit the execute key. It took exactly 12 minutes for the federal system to process the raw data. I watched my screen as the master nodes of the Weston Family Trust blinked from a healthy, active green to a deadlocked red. Every primary account, every secondary credit line, every offshore holding fund, and every corporate discretionary account was instantly frozen. Money leaves a digital echo, and I had a front-row seat to the silence. I knew exactly who would be the first to hit the brick wall. Caroline Weston possessed a remarkably predictable psychology. Whenever she felt slighted, threatened, or publicly embarrassed as she had been by Andre walking out on her that morning, she self-medicated with aggressive, conspicuous consumption. She needed to assert her dominance. She needed to spend her family's money to remind herself that she was superior to everyone else. Less than 3 miles away, on the affluent cobblestone stretch of Newberry Street, Caroline was executing her standard coping mechanism. She marched into the VIP suite of the Cartier boutique, flanked by 2 of her most vicious high society friends. These were women who measured loyalty entirely in carat weight and social standing. Caroline threw herself onto a plush velvet sofa, demanding espresso and champagne, acting as though the morning's humiliation at the mansion had never happened. She waved a dismissive, impatient hand at the boutique director, a polished man named Henri, who had catered to the Weston family's extravagant whims for a decade. She did not want to browse. She wanted to conquer. Bring me the Platinum Riviera collar, Caroline commanded, her voice loud enough to ensure the other wealthy patrons in the boutique noticed her presence. The cascading piece. Henri hurried to the secure vault, returning with a velvet tray. Resting on the dark fabric was a breathtaking necklace of brilliant cut diamonds, carrying a staggering price tag of $150,000. Caroline did not ask the price. She did not negotiate. She barely even looked at the craftsmanship. She simply reached into her designer handbag and produced the Weston Family Trust Black Card, a heavy titanium card tied directly to the Central Foundation funds. "Wrap it up," she ordered, taking a sip of her champagne and offering a smug, superior smile to her two friends. "I need something sparkling for the charity gala next month." Henri offered a practiced, deferential bow and took the heavy card to the discreet processing terminal in the corner of the VIP suite. From the hood of Andre's car in the parking garage, I watched the transaction attempt hit the frozen server. A notification flashed across my screen. Point of sale, authorization, requested, Cartier Boston. Amount $150,000. I smiled as the federal freeze automatically engaged. Status code 05, do not honor. Asset seizure protocol. Back in the boutique, the terminal beeped a sharp, unpleasant tone. Henri frowned, swiping the heavy titanium card a second time. The machine flashed the same aggressive red warning. He looked at the screen, his professional composure faltering. Henri returned to the velvet sofa. He leaned down, lowering his voice to a discreet, apologetic whisper, trying desperately to save Caroline from public embarrassment. "Madame Caroline." "I am so sorry," Henri murmured. "It appears the card has been declined. Perhaps there is a security hold." Caroline scoffed, her voice sharp and ringing through the quiet room. "Do not be ridiculous, Henri. It is a Weston Trust card. There is no limit. Run it again. Your machine is obviously broken." "I have run it twice, madam. The issuer is not authorizing the transaction." The two socialite friends stopped sipping their champagne. The silence in the VIP suite grew heavy and suffocating. Caroline's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. Her carefully constructed facade of invincibility cracked. "Fine," she snapped, digging frantically into her handbag. Her hands were shaking. She pulled out her personal platinum credit card and shoved it at the director. "Use this one. And I expect a discount for this incompetence." Henri took the card, his face pale. He swiped it. The terminal beeped again. "Declined." On my screen, a cascade of red alerts flooded the terminal. Caroline was panicking blindly, throwing plastic at the wall. She marched over to the counter herself, shoving Henri aside, and pulled out a joint debit card tied to Andre's clinical account. She swiped it violently. "Declined." Caroline, one of her friends, said, her voice dripping with sudden venomous judgment. "Is everything all right financially?" "Shut up!" Caroline hissed, her panic escalating into full-blown hysteria. She slammed her hand against the glass counter. "What is wrong with your system, Henri? Do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is? I will have you fired by the end of the day." Henri took a step back, looking at the terminal screen, his eyes widening as he read the secondary automated message provided by the merchant bank. "Madam," he stated, his voice losing its deferential warmth and turning strictly professional, "the bank is not reporting a security hold. The terminal indicates a code 05. The issuer states that all associated assets have been seized under a federal injunction." The word "seized" echoed in the pristine, quiet boutique. It was social cyanide. The two socialite friends slowly set their champagne flutes down on the table. They exchanged a single, ruthless glance. In their world, federal asset seizure was a highly contagious disease. "You know, Caroline, I just remembered. I have a hard lunch reservation," one of the women said, grabbing her coat and backing away toward the door. "We should probably go. We will call you later," the other lied smoothly, following right behind her. They abandoned her instantly. The social death was absolute and immediate. Caroline stood alone in the center of the boutique, surrounded by millions of dollars in diamonds she could no longer afford. The heavy titanium cards scattered across the glass counter were nothing but useless pieces of metal. The reality of her situation crashed down on her, suffocating and absolute. She snatched her phone from her purse and ran out of the boutique, ignoring Henri, ignoring the stares of the staff. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stumbled out onto the bustling Newberry Street sidewalk. The cold wind hit her flushed face. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she scrolled frantically through her contacts. She hit the dial button, pressing the phone to her ear with trembling fingers. Patricia Weston answered on the second ring. "Mom." Caroline gasped, tears of pure terror spilling over her mascara. "The money is gone. All of it." The clock was indeed ticking, but for Caroline Weston, the morning's humiliations required an immediate, expensive remedy. When reality became too uncomfortable, Caroline did what she had been trained to do since birth. She bought her way out of it. She marched through the heavy glass doors of the Cartier boutique on Newberry Street, flanked by two women who were less friends and more paid sycophants. Caroline's posture was rigid, her chin tilted at a defiant angle designed to mask the lingering sting of Andre walking out on her. She demanded the VIP suite. She demanded champagne. She needed to assert her dominance, to remind the world and herself that she was a Weston, untouchable and supreme. "Bring me the Platinum Riviera collar," Caroline ordered, sinking into a velvet sofa and waving a dismissive hand at the boutique director. "The cascading piece we discussed last month." The director, a polished man who had catered to the Weston family's extravagant whims for a decade, hurried to the secure vault. He returned carrying a velvet tray that held a breathtaking necklace of brilliant cut diamonds. The price tag was a staggering $150,000. Caroline did not negotiate. She barely even inspected the craftsmanship. She simply reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the heavy titanium card tied directly to the Weston Family Trust, and dropped it onto the glass table. "Wrap it up," she commanded, taking a sip of her champagne and offering a smug smile to her companions. "I need something spectacular for the gala." The director offered a practiced bow and carried the card to the discreet processing terminal in the corner of the suite. He swiped the titanium edge through the machine. A sharp, unpleasant tone echoed in the quiet room. The terminal flashed a glaring red warning. The director frowned, wiping the magnetic strip on his jacket sleeve before swiping it a second time. The machine emitted the same aggressive, rejecting beep. He stared at the screen, his professional composure faltering as he read the automated message provided by the merchant bank. He returned to the velvet sofa, leaning down to lower his voice to a discreet whisper. "Madam Caroline, I am so sorry," he murmured. "It appears the card has been declined. Perhaps there is a security hold." Caroline scoffed, her voice loud and sharp. "Do not be ridiculous. It is a Weston Trust card. There is no limit. Run it again. Your machine is obviously broken. I have run it twice, madam. The issuer is not authorizing the transaction." The two socialite friends stopped sipping their champagne. The silence in the VIP suite grew heavy and suffocating. Caroline's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. Her carefully constructed facade of invincibility cracked. "Fine," she snapped, digging frantically into her handbag. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her personal platinum credit card and shoved it at the director. "Use this one, and I expect an apology for this incompetence." The director swiped the second card. "Declined." Caroline marched over to the counter herself, shoving the man aside. She pulled out a joint debit card tied to Andre's clinical account, swiping it violently. "Declined." "Caroline," one of her friends said, her voice dripping with sudden, venomous judgment. "Is everything all right financially?" "Shut up!" Caroline hissed, her panic escalating into full-blown hysteria. She slammed her hand against the glass counter. "What is wrong with your system? Do you know who my father is? I will have you fired by the end of the day." The director took a step back, his voice losing its deferential warmth and turning strictly professional. "Madam, the bank is not reporting a security hold. The terminal indicates a code 05. The issuer states that all associated assets have been seized under a federal emergency injunction due to suspected embezzlement." The words "seized" echoed in the pristine boutique. It was social cyanide. Her friends exchanged a single ruthless glance. muttered empty excuses about lunch reservations, and practically sprinted out the door, abandoning her instantly. Caroline stood alone, surrounded by millions of dollars in diamonds she could no longer afford. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She snatched her phone from her purse, ran out of the boutique, and stumbled onto the bustling sidewalk. She hit the dial button, pressing the phone to her ear with trembling fingers. Patricia Weston answered on the second ring. Mom Caroline gasped, tears of pure terror spilling over her mascara. The money is gone, all of it. Across the city, far removed from the panic radiating out of Newbury Street, Abby walked through the serene, freezing pathways of the Boston Public Garden. She pushed Leo's stroller at a steady, rhythmic pace. Her encrypted laptop was securely zipped in her bag, having just received the automated confirmation that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had executed the freeze she had engineered. The Weston Trust, the shell companies, the foundation ledgers, every single asset was locked down. For the first time in over a year, Abby took a deep breath of winter air without feeling the crushing weight of Richard Weston's shadow. Leo was fast asleep, swaddled in thick blankets, safe and entirely untouchable. Abigail. The voice was ragged, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. Abby did not flinch. She stopped the stroller, locked the brake, and turned slowly. Patricia Weston stood on the paved walkway a few yards away. The sight of her was jarring. For 35 years, Patricia had been the undisputed queen of Boston society, wielding her wealth and status like a diamond-encrusted weapon. Her posture was normally rigid with superiority. Her wardrobe meticulously curated, her expression a mask of bored condescension. Not today. Patricia looked completely unraveled. Her expensive cashmere coat was hastily buttoned, the collar askew. Her hair, usually sprayed into a flawless blonde helmet, was windblown and flat. The heavy makeup she used to project intimidation now highlighted the deep, terrified lines around her mouth and eyes. She was shaking. The matriarch of the Weston family looked like a cornered animal. "You did this," Patricia stated. Her voice was not a demand. It was a breathless, terrified realization. "Caroline just called me screaming. Her cards are dead. Richard's accounts are locked. The entire trust is frozen." Abby maintained her silence, her face a mask of cold, analytical stone, letting the older woman stew in the reality of her collapsing world. Patricia took a step closer, her eyes darting around the empty park. "Richard is tearing his study apart. He is threatening to fire every lawyer on his payroll. He thinks it is a misunderstanding, a banking error. But I know it is you. I know you found the ledgers." If Richard was foolish enough to let his daughter launder pediatric oncology funds through his accounts, he deserves the federal inquiry, Abby replied, her voice flat and completely devoid of sympathy. "You should go home, Patricia. The authorities will be executing search warrants on your properties by tomorrow morning." Patricia did not turn around. She did not defend her husband or her daughter. Instead, she closed the distance between them, stopping just inches from the stroller. She looked down at Leo, then up at Abby. Her eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a panic that went far deeper than frozen bank accounts. "The money does not matter," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking. "The federal investigation. The seized assets, Richard can survive that. He can hire a fleet of attorneys to keep him out of prison. But you did not just stop at the money, did you, Abigail? You went after the bloodline." "I am simply ensuring my son is legally recognized," Abby stated, unflinching. "Carter tried to forge a medical document to strip me of my rights. I am providing the federal court with undeniable DNA certified proof of Leo's lineage, Richard's blood matching his grandson's. It is the only way to stop your son." Patricia let out a choked, ragged gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She knew. She absolutely knew what that independent federal-level test was going to reveal. "Please," Patricia begged, her voice dropping to a desperate, frantic plea. "I know you drew Richard's blood today. Andre was too quiet, too compliant. I saw the way he looked at Caroline before he left. I know what you are doing. You cannot submit that sample. You cannot let a federal judge see that DNA profile." "Why not?" Abby asked, feigning ignorance just to watch her squirm. "It will secure Leo's place in the trust. It will prove he is a Weston. Because Carter is not a Weston." Patricia shrieked the horrific truth finally tearing out of her throat. The admission hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Patricia swayed on her feet, her hands trembling violently as she reached into her designer handbag. She bypassed her useless platinum credit cards and pulled out a single, crisp slip of paper. She thrust it toward Abby. It was a cashier's check, issued from an independent offshore account that had miraculously avoided the federal sweep. It was made out to cash. $2 million! Patricia choked out, shoving the paper closer to Abby's chest. Take it, Abby. Take it right now. It is untraceable. It is everything I have hidden away for myself. Take the money, pack up your son, and leave the country tonight. Go to Europe. Go to South America. Just disappear and destroy that vial. Do not tell Richard what Carter saw on that paper. Do not let that lab run the sequence. You want me to take a bribe to protect the man who tried to steal my baby? Abby asked, her voice laced with pure venom. Patricia's knees buckled. The queen of Boston society collapsed into the freezing dirt of the public park. The immaculate cashmere coat soaked up the mud. She grabbed the hem of Abby's coat, looking up with a face completely destroyed by fear. She was not crying for her son, she was crying for her own survival. Carter's father was the estate gardener. Patricia sobbed, the ugly guarded secret of 35 years spilling out between jagged breaths. Richard was always away on business. I was lonely. It was a stupid, meaningless mistake. But Richard is a monster, Abby. You know what he is capable of. If that DNA test goes to a federal judge, the results become public record. It will prove Carter has no Weston blood. It will prove my betrayal. Richard will not just divorce me, he will kill me. He will destroy Carter. He will erase us from the face of the earth. She remained on her knees in the dirt, holding the cashier's checkup like a pathetic offering to a new god. $2 million, she wept, her breath clouding in the cold air. Please, just take it and run. Abby looked down at the trembling woman in the mud. She looked at the check fluttering in the bitter wind. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, she reached out her hand. My fingers closed around the thick watermarked paper, slipping it easily from Patricia's trembling grip. A heavy, ragged sigh of relief escaped the older woman's lips, her shoulders sagging as she mistakenly believed she had just purchased her salvation. Kneeling in the freezing mud of the Boston Public Garden, Patricia looked up at me with mascara running in dark, ugly rivers down her cheeks. She was waiting for me to turn the stroller around, walk away, and vanish into the shadows like a dutiful, bought-off problem. I held the cashier's check up, letting the bleak winter light catch the staggering string of zeros printed across the center. $2 million. It was an astronomical sum, a number that could instantly secure a comfortable, quiet life anywhere in the world. I could take my son board a flight to Europe and disappear entirely. I could walk away from the chaos, the threats, and the suffocating grip of the Weston family without ever looking back. For a fraction of a second, I let the silence stretch across the deserted pathway, analyzing the immense weight of the paper in my hand. Then I looked down at the woman groveling at my feet. This was the same matriarch who had sat in my living room 3 weeks ago, sipping imported tea while casually referring to my infant son as a bastard mistake. This was the woman who had orchestrated my social exile, who had eagerly signed off on Carter's plan to lock me in a psychiatric ward, who had treated my very existence as a stain on her family's pristine legacy. She had never offered me an ounce of mercy, and now she expected to buy mine with money she had hoarded while her husband destroyed lives. My grip on the paper tightened. I did not fold the check. I did not slip it into my coat pocket. Instead, I gripped the top edge and pulled my hands apart in one swift, violent motion. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot in the crisp, dead air. Patricia gasped, her bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror as her brain struggled to process the visual. I brought the two severed halves together and tore them again. Then again. I reduced her $2 million bribe to a handful of worthless, jagged confetti. I opened my palms, letting the tiny white scraps flutter down like snow. The pieces settled mockingly into Patricia's ruined hair and the mud-splattered lapels of her expensive cashmere coat. "You think I want your dirty money?" I whispered sharply, my voice cutting through the freezing wind like a serrated blade. I want to watch the Western Empire burn to the ground because of your arrogance." The sheer shock of the rejection severed whatever fragile thread of sanity Patricia had left. The groveling, terrified woman vanished in an instant, replaced entirely by a cornered, vicious animal. She scrambled backward in the dirt, her hands clawing desperately at the pavement as she forced herself up to her feet. Her face twisted into a feral, ugly mask of pure hatred, her teeth bared like a rabid dog. "You stupid, arrogant little girl!" Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged, startling a flock of pigeons from the nearby oak trees. "You have no idea what you have just done. You think a DNA test makes you powerful? You think you can outmaneuver this family?" I stood my ground, keeping my body positioned firmly between her erratic, violent movements and Leo's stroller. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I let her unravel, observing her collapse with the cold detachment of a scientist watching a failed experiment. "Richard will destroy you!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger that was now caked in dark mud directly at my face. "You hear me? He will destroy you." Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the executive board is convening. Carter is presenting the medical injunction to the directors. They are going to declare you completely unfit and legally unstable. My husband owns the judges in this city. He owns the medical board. He owns the press. By noon tomorrow, you will be strapped to a bed in a locked ward, and your son will be raised by nannies who will teach him to forget your name. You are projecting your own terror. "Patricia," I stated calmly, watching her chest heave with panic. "You are not screaming at me because you think Richard will win tomorrow. You are screaming because you know exactly what Richard will do to you when that independent laboratory report lands on his pristine desk. You have spent 35 years pretending Carter was the rightful heir to a dynasty. You elevated a gardener's son to the head of the Western Empire, letting him rule with the exact same arrogance as the man who raised him. When Richard realizes his entire legacy is a biological fraud, he will not aim his fury at me. He will aim it entirely at you." Patricia clamped her hands over her ears as if she could physically block out the truth of my words. She let out a guttural, panicked cry, turned on her heel, and began running. She stumbled in her ruined designer heels, nearly tripping over the uneven brick pavement, fleeing toward the Charles Street exit without looking back once. She looked nothing like Boston elite. She looked exactly like a woman running for her life. I watched her retreating figure until she disappeared behind the heavy iron gates of the park. The profound silence of the public garden returned, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of my son sleeping peacefully in his carriage. I brushed a stray scrap of the torn cashier's check off the leather handle of the stroller. Slowly I reached down beneath the thick wool blankets tucked securely around Leo. My fingers bypassed the diaper bag, the extra bottles, and the spare pacifiers, closing firmly around a small rectangular piece of black plastic hidden deep in the lining. I pulled the digital audio recorder out into the cold air. A small red light blinked steadily on the top right corner, indicating it had been actively capturing every single word spoken over the last 10 minutes. I pressed the stop button to halt the recording, then hit play. The audio was flawless. It picked up the ambient sound of the howling wind, followed instantly by the terrified, crystal-clear voice of Patricia Weston echoing from the small speaker. Carter's father was the estate gardener. The recorded voice sobbed, the desperation vibrating through the digital playback. "Richard will kill me if he finds out." I hit stop, dropping the device safely into my coat pocket. The financial freeze had paralyzed their accounts. The medical strike had set the legal trap. But this recording was the final match I needed to ignite the inferno. The cold weight of the digital recorder in my coat pocket was a comforting anchor. I watched Patricia's retreating figure disappear into the Boston traffic, her frantic flight a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of the park. My phone vibrated against my hip, breaking the silence of the freezing morning. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a message from Carter. He had attached a high-resolution image of a legal document. The heading was emblazoned with the Weston family crest and the heavy Gothic font of their primary law firm. Below the image was a single line of text. "Tomorrow at the annual shareholder meeting, Dad is transferring the $500 million trust entirely to me. You lose Abby." I stared at the message, a genuine smile touching my lips. He was so blindingly arrogant, so insulated by his lifetime of unearned privilege, that he had no idea the ground beneath his feet had already collapsed. He believed he was inheriting an empire. He was actually demanding the keys to a sinking ship. 2 hours later, I pushed open the heavy double doors of my secure suite at the Intercontinental. The spacious room had been completely transformed over the past week into a financial war room. Heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight against the city skyline. The expensive mahogany dining table was buried under stacks of physical ledgers, printouts of offshore routing codes, and empty coffee cups. Jonathan sat at the head of the table. His suit jacket was draped over a chair, his tie discarded, and his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He looked up from a thick stack of printed bank statements as I wheeled Leo's stroller into the room. I unbuttoned my coat and tossed my phone onto the table. It slid across the smooth wood and stopped against a stack of Vanguard medical files. Read the latest dispatch from the Golden Boy, I instructed. Jonathan picked up the phone, tapping the screen to read Carter's gloating text. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, tossing the device back onto the table. The sheer magnitude of their delusion is almost impressive. He wants the trust. He is practically begging for it. Let him have it, I replied. I lifted a sleeping Leo from his stroller and carried him to the portable crib we had set up in the adjacent bedroom. I paused for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall. Everything I had done, every calculated strike against the most powerful family in Boston, was to ensure that no Weston would ever cast a shadow over this child again. When I returned to the main suite, I poured myself a glass of ice water and took a seat opposite Jonathan. Show me the final autopsy of the Weston Empire, I commanded. Jonathan turned his laptop screen toward me. It was not just a list of frozen accounts, it was a digital graveyard. The financial freeze I had initiated earlier that morning had triggered an automated domino effect across international banking algorithms. But the freeze was just the tourniquet. The actual audit we had compiled was the lethal injection. We spent the next 4 hours reviewing the final numbers. The Weston Trust, valued on paper at $500 million, was a massive, elaborately constructed illusion. Richard Weston had not built a sustainable financial institution. He had built a predatory lending syndicate, masquerading as a venture capital firm. Look at the routing for their primary holdings, Jonathan said, pointing the tip of his pen at a complex flowchart taped to the wall. The liquidity does not exist. Richard leveraged the core assets of the trust against non-existent offshore collateral in the Cayman Islands. He used the Vanguard medical bribes to inflate the perceived value of their healthcare portfolio. He then used those inflated numbers to secure massive corporate loans from domestic banks. He was paying off the old debt with the new debt, I noted, tracing the intricate lines of the chart. It is a classic Ponzi structure dressed up in custom tailoring and charity galas. Exactly, Jonathan confirmed, leaning back in his chair. And Caroline's Pediatric Oncology Foundation was the slush fund. When the domestic loans were not enough to cover his margin calls, Richard siphoned untaxed charity donations directly into the central trust to keep the illusion of solvency alive. The $500 million trust Carter is so eager to inherit is entirely fabricated. It is a black hole of toxic debt, predatory loans, and catastrophic wire fraud. I looked down at the massive 500-page forensic audit Jonathan and our team of independent forensic accountants had meticulously assembled. It documented every fake shell company, every forged asset appraisal, every diverted charity dollar, and every single federal bribe. It was an undeniable, mathematically perfect map of decades of white-collar crime. By transferring the trust entirely to Carter tomorrow morning, I said, my voice cold and precise, Richard is legally transferring the liability. Carter is demanding to be named the sole architect of a bankrupt criminal enterprise. Jonathan offered a grim, satisfied nod. Once his signature is on that transfer document, Carter Weston absorbs the entirety of the federal exposure. The moment the government moves in, Richard will claim ignorance and point the finger directly at his son. Carter is securing his own prison sentence, and he is doing it with a smile on his face. I pulled my laptop toward me, waking the screen. I opened the highly encrypted email client we had established for this exact moment. In the attachment field, I loaded the master PDF file of the forensic audit. 500 pages of absolute inescapable destruction. In the recipient field, I did not type the names of local authorities or friendly judges on the Weston payroll. Local law enforcement could be bought. Federal algorithms could not. I typed the direct secure intake addresses for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division. I stared at the screen. I thought about the forged medical records Carter intended to use to rip my son from my arms. I thought about Richard Weston's suffocating arrogance and his threats to ruin me. I thought about Patricia groveling in the dirt, offering me stolen money to protect a 35-year lie. They believed they were the predators. They believed they were untouchable. I smiled at the glowing screen. My finger hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before coming down hard on the enter key. The progress bar flashed green. Sent. The digital bomb was in the air, hurtling directly toward the highest federal authorities in the country. There was no stopping it. There were no bribes large enough to undo the math. The Weston family was a walking corpse, they just did not know it yet. I closed the laptop with a sharp, decisive click. I looked across the table at Jonathan. He was already reaching for his suit jacket, a predator preparing for the final hunt. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Let's go to a board meeting. The morning sun struck the glass facade of the Weston Financial Tower, casting long, sharp blades of light across the Boston financial district. On the 60th floor inside the executive boardroom, the air hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of old money and unchecked arrogance. This was Richard Weston's sanctuary. The room was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished mahogany, and imported Italian leather. It was designed to intimidate, to remind everyone who entered exactly who held power and who was entirely disposable. Richard stood near the head of the massive custom-built conference table, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. He was completely in his element, shaking hands with the senior partners and key shareholders who had gathered for the annual meeting. He projected an aura of absolute terrifying invincibility. If the federal asset freeze I had triggered the day before had rattled him, he did not show a single trace of it to his audience. To the men in this room, he was a king, preparing to pass down a pristine dynasty. He believed his attorneys were handling a minor clerical error. He had no idea he was standing in the center of a burning building. Beside him stood Carter, radiating a smug, insufferable confidence. Carter adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his chest puffed out like a peacock. Today was meant to be his coronation. He looked down at the pristine leather binding of the transfer documents resting at the center of the table. A gold-plated pen lay waiting beside the signature line. Today, the legendary $500 million Weston Trust was being transferred entirely into his name. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully crushed me, secured his legacy, and cemented his place as the untouchable heir to the throne. He offered a sly, victorious grin to a passing investor, completely oblivious to the fact that he was eager to sign his name to a massive federal indictment. Across the room, Caroline Weston sat rigidly in her designated leather chair. She looked unusually pale, her makeup applied slightly too heavy in a desperate attempt to hide the dark bruised circles under her eyes. Yesterday's public humiliation at the Cartier boutique and the terrifying realization of the frozen accounts had left her brittle and fragile. Yet she clung to the delusion that her father would simply wave his hand and fix the glitch. She gripped her porcelain coffee cup so tightly, her knuckles were stark white, pretending to listen to a conversation between two minor shareholders while her eyes darted nervously toward the door. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom opened with a soft, muted click. It was not the catering staff bringing fresh espresso. It was Andre. He did not look like the exhausted, subservient doctor the Weston family had manipulated and controlled for years. He was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit that fit him flawlessly. His posture was perfectly straight, his jaw set in granite, and his dark eyes burned with a cold, absolute resolve. He walked into the lion's den without a single ounce of hesitation. The quiet murmur of the boardroom began to falter as people noticed his entrance. He belonged in a clinical wing, not crashing a high-level shareholder meeting. Caroline saw him and her eyes widened in pure panic. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She marched toward him, cutting off his path, keeping her voice in a harsh, frantic whisper to avoid drawing more attention. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, grabbing his forearm. "You are supposed to be at the hospital. You cannot just walk in here, Andre. My father is about to start the meeting. Go home before you embarrass me." Andre smoothly pulled his arm out of her grasp. He did not whisper. He spoke in a clear, caring tone that sliced cleanly through the remaining chatter in the room. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick manila envelope, holding it out to her. "Take it, Caroline." She stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. "What is this? Have you lost your mind?" "We have guests." Andre stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the immense weight of a man who had finally broken his chains. "These are divorce papers. I have already signed them. My attorneys have filed the emergency injunctions to permanently separate my clinical practice from your family's toxic accounts." Caroline's breath hitched. She looked around frantically, realizing that the minor shareholders and senior partners had completely stopped talking. Every single eye in the room was fixed on her. Her carefully constructed world of perfection was being dismantled in front of the very people she desperately needed to impress. "You are making a scene," she stammered, her voice trembling as the facade shattered. "You cannot do this to me. Not today. I am a Weston. You need me." "I never needed you, Caroline." Andre stated, his voice devoid of any warmth or regret. "I tolerated you. I let your father use my medical license to legitimize your fraudulent foundations. I let you use my name to cover up your empty, hollow life. But I am done. I am done being your shield." Caroline let out a high, thin gasp. She snatched the envelope from his hand, her fingers shaking so violently that the heavy paper slipped and hit the floor, spilling official legal documents across the pristine rug. She stared down at the papers, her chest heaving rapidly. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her throat as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The social embarrassment, combined with the sheer terror of the frozen accounts and her husband walking out, broke her completely. She stumbled backward, bumping hard against the conference table, gasping for air as a few shareholders stepped back in alarm. Richard Weston finally noticed the commotion disrupting his perfect morning. He set his water glass down with a sharp crack that echoed in the silence. His face darkened into a mask of pure fury as he marched toward the back of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Andre, get out of my boardroom this instant. You have no business here." Carter moved quickly to stand beside his father, puffing out his chest and pointing a finger at his brother-in-law. "You heard him, Andre. Take your pathetic drama somewhere else. This is a closed meeting for actual shareholders. You are trespassing." Andre did not retreat. He did not cower under Richard's glare. He simply turned his head and looked at the heavy double doors leading out to the executive reception area. "I am not the one bringing the drama," Richard Andre said, calmly taking a deliberate step to the side. "I am just the opening act." Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung wide open, hitting the rubber wall stops with a resounding, undeniable thud. The sound silenced whatever protests Richard was about to unleash. I walked into the Weston boardroom. I was not wearing the exhausted, terrified expression of a woman fighting for her life. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my shoulders pulled back, my head held high. I owned the air in the room the second I crossed the threshold. Jonathan flanked my left side, radiating the lethal, polished energy of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Andre smoothly stepped back from Caroline and fell into formation on my right side. Cradled securely in my arms was a heavy stack of glossy jet-black folders. The silence in the room shattered the moment my heel struck the hardwood floor. Richard Weston's face, normally a mask of cool, aristocratic control, twisted into a violent shade of crimson. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the crystal water glasses and spilling water across the polished wood. Security. Richard roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. Remove this woman immediately. Throw them all out. Call the police and have them arrested for corporate espionage. Two massive security guards in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the catering station, moving swiftly toward us. Carter sneered, crossing his arms over his chest, clearly relishing the prospect of watching me dragged out of his coronation in handcuffs. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Jonathan smoothly intercepted the guards, stepping right into their path. He did not yell. He did not raise his hands. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a thick folded document bearing the undeniable heavy seal of the federal court. He slapped it down onto the polished mahogany table with a resounding smack. I would strongly advise against touching her, Jonathan stated, his voice ringing with absolute lethal authority. Unless you and your employer are eager to add federal obstruction of justice to today's rapidly growing list of criminal charges. The guards froze their eyes, darting uncertainly from the legal document to Richard. Richard scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the tense room. What kind of fabricated garbage is this? You cannot walk into a private shareholder meeting with fake papers. Get them out of my sight. It is a federal injunction, Jonathan replied, tapping the raised seal on the paper. Signed and executed at 8 o'clock this morning by a federal judge. Abigail is now legally recognized as an official court-appointed auditor of the disputed Weston Family Trust. She has full unrestricted access to this meeting, your ledgers, and your internal communications pending an active federal investigation. You lay one finger on her, Richard, and you violate a direct federal mandate. A wave of panicked murmurs rippled around the massive conference table. The minor shareholders and senior partners, men who had spent their entire lives shielded by wealth and influence, shifted uncomfortably in their Italian leather chairs. The smell of fear suddenly overpowered the scent of expensive cologne in the room. Caroline let out a soft whimper from the corner, clutching her divorce papers to her chest as she watched her husband stand firmly by my side. Carter's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but his arrogance quickly overrode his common sense. He stepped up to the head of the table, placing himself between me and the leather-bound transfer documents. This is pathetic, Abby. Carter spat, his voice dripping with condescension. You are bluffing. You think you can waltz in here with some desperate legal stunt and stop what is happening today? Dad, just ignore them. They are stalling because they know they have already lost. Richard took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his suit. He was a master of manipulation, a man who had built an empire on projecting unshakable confidence. He looked at the anxious faces of his board members and immediately shifted back into his role as the untouchable patriarch. He offered them a warm, reassuring smile that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. My son is right, Richard announced, his booming voice designed to soothe the panicked investors. This is nothing but a desperate, delusional distraction. A disgruntled former associate is attempting to extort this family with fabricated legalities because she knows she has no actual claim to our assets. We will let our legal team handle this nuisance later this afternoon. Today is not about baseless threats. Today is about the future of this company. He turned his back on me, completely taking his place behind the sleek glass podium at the head of the room. He placed a hand proudly on Carter's shoulder. The irony of the moment was so thick I could practically taste it. Patricia was nowhere to be found. She had fled the city, leaving her husband to blindly champion a son who possessed not a single drop of Weston blood. I built this empire from the ground up, Richard declared, his voice echoing through the opulent space. And today I ensure its survival for the next century. Today I transfer the reins of my pure, unbroken Weston legacy to my true-born son, Carter. The board members offered a smattering of hesitant applause. Carter beamed, puffing out his chest as he reached for the gold-plated pen resting beside the transfer documents. He was seconds away from signing his name. He was seconds away from officially absorbing $500 million in toxic, fraudulent debt, perfectly orchestrated by the very father who was handing him the pen. I did not wait for him to sign. I walked deliberately toward the front of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The shareholders watched me in paralyzed silence. I bypassed Carter entirely and stepped right up to the main presentation console built into the side of the podium. Richard's eyes widened in sudden alarm. "Get away from there, security, grab her." It was too late. I reached out and snatched the master remote for the room's central projector system off the console. I did not bother trying to guess the password. Jonathan had already provided me with the override code, a backdoor sequence he had hacked into their network earlier that morning. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, offering him a cold, merciless smile. "This woman is delusional. Let us see exactly what your pure legacy looks like, Richard." I pressed a single keystroke. The massive digital screen behind Richard, which had been proudly displaying the gold Weston Financial crest, flickered violently. The pristine logo vanished in an instant. The room plunged into a sharp, glaring light as the screen was overtaken by a massive, unavoidable chart. The graphics were completely saturated in bright, aggressive red. It was a flawless, undeniable visual representation of the catastrophic offshore debt swallowing the Weston Trust whole, displaying every forged asset and predatory loan for the entire board to see. The blinding red light from the massive digital screen washed over the faces of the Weston Financial board members, bathing the opulent room in the color of a financial massacre. The jagged descending lines of the chart were unmistakable. They represented a catastrophic freefall, a sheer drop into negative equity that defied all logic and reason. For 10 agonizing seconds, the boardroom was entirely silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the projector and the rapid, shallow breathing of Caroline Weston, who was still slumped against the far wall, clutching her divorce papers as if they were a physical shield. I stepped away from the console and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. Jonathan moved in flawless synchronization, stepping to the edge of the mahogany table and tossing the glossy black folders out to the senior partners. They landed with heavy, authoritative thuds in front of men and women who were suddenly realizing that their vast, carefully guarded fortunes were evaporating before their very eyes. "Open them," I commanded, my voice calm, clinical, and echoing clearly across the expansive space. What you are looking at on the screen is not a projection or a worst-case scenario. It is a real-time, federally authenticated audit of the Weston Family Trust. An older man with silver hair and a custom-tailored suit hesitantly opened the folder in front of him. His eyes scanned the first page, and the color instantly drained from his face. He looked up at Richard, his expression shifting from lifelong deference to absolute horror. "Richard," he whispered, his voice trembling as he traced a line on the paper. "What are these routing numbers? What is this Cayman registry? What have you done?" I did not give Richard the chance to formulate a lie. I kept my gaze locked on the shareholders pacing slowly alongside the table like a prosecuting attorney delivering a closing argument. "For the past decade, Richard Weston has sold you an illusion of invulnerability." I stated my words sharp and precise. "He promised you a dynasty built on secure generational wealth and unshakable market dominance. But the reality is a mathematically perfect Ponzi scheme. The offshore collateral backing your primary corporate loans does not exist. The healthcare portfolio valuations, specifically the Vanguard medical assets, were artificially inflated using systematic documented kickbacks. Richard paid off old debt by securing new debt using your investments as the ultimate sacrificial lamb to keep the doors of this tower open." Richard finally found his voice, stepping away from the podium with his hands raised. His face twisted into a mask of desperate fury. "Lies. It is all fabricated garbage. Do not look at those files. She is a disgruntled ex-wife, trying to extort us." Page 42. I countered instantly, not even bothering to look in his direction. "Turn to page 42. You will find the exact wire transfers authorized by Richard Weston, siphoning untaxed charitable donations from Caroline's Pediatric Oncology Foundation directly into a central holding account to cover a massive margin call last November." The sound of frantic page-turning filled the room. Gasps of disbelief and muttered curses erupted as the board members verified the undeniable proof resting in their own hands. I turned my attention to the man of the hour, the heir apparent, who was currently gripping the edge of the podium as if it were a life raft in a hurricane. Carter's face had gone entirely slack, his mouth slightly open, the gold-plated pen he was meant to sign his legacy with forgotten on the glass surface. And then there is Carter. I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal calm. The son tasked with managing the domestic real estate acquisitions. When the foundation money was no longer enough to cover the bleeding, Carter took matters into his own hands. Turn to page 89. Carter flinched, as if I had physically struck him. You will see the paper trail of Carter's personal embezzlement, I declared, raising my voice to carry over the rising tide of panic in the room. He drained the employee pension fund to cover his own gambling debts and private equity failures. But worse than that, he needed capital to keep the shell companies afloat. There is no $500 million trust. The Weston family is $300 million in debt. Carter illegally used shareholder assets as collateral to cover his embezzlement. The boardroom erupted. The carefully maintained decorum of Boston's elite shattered, instantly replaced by the primal chaotic panic of wealthy people realizing they had been utterly robbed. A senior partner threw his black folder across the table, shouting obscenities at Richard. Two women near the back scrambled out of their chairs, dialing their personal attorneys on their cell phones. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of rage, betrayal, and sheer terror. Richard tried to shout over the din, slamming his fists on the table demanding order, but he was completely ignored. His invincible aura was gone, stripped away by the cold, hard mathematics of his own greed. He was no longer a king holding court. He was a common criminal cornered in his own castle. Carter, however, could not handle the destruction of his reality. The smug, untouchable golden boy vanished, replaced entirely by a sweating, panicked animal. Dark patches of sweat bloomed under the arms of his expensive suit. He ripped his tie loose, his chest heaving as he stared at the red chart of ruin dominating the wall. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape before finally locking onto me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "She is lying!" Carter screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face. He lunged away from the podium, spittle flying from his lips, his face contorted in a pathetic display of rage. "Do not listen to her. She manufactured those documents. She is a crazy, cheating whore trying to steal my birthright." His insult hung in the air, a desperate, ugly sound that briefly cut through the surrounding chaos. The shareholders stopped shouting, turning in stunned silence to watch Carter's complete psychological meltdown. He stood there panting, his face red and blotchy, expecting his father to back him up, expecting his last name to magically shield him from the consequences of his own actions. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single flicker of anger or intimidation. I let the heavy silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the absolute pathetic nature of his outburst to settle over the room. My voice cut through the remaining chaos like a serrated knife, cold, measured and vibrating with absolute certainty. "Your birthright?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Let's talk about bloodlines, Carter." I did not take my eyes off his sweating, terrified face as I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, subtle signal. At the back of the room, Andre moved with swift military precision. He stepped backward to the heavy mahogany double doors, grabbed the brass handles and pulled them shut. He reached up and engaged the heavy industrial deadbolts. The loud metallic click echoed through the boardroom with terrifying finality. The doors were locked. No one was leaving. The metallic echo of the deadbolts sliding into place acted like a physical blow to the room. The screaming shareholders instantly fell silent, turning their heads toward the heavy mahogany doors. They were trapped inside the glass walls of the 60th floor, sealed inside a rapidly collapsing empire. From the private adjoining executive lounge, a side door clicked open. Two of Jonathan's security operatives stepped into the glaring light of the boardroom, guiding a woman firmly by the elbows. It was Patricia Weston. She had attempted to flee the city yesterday afternoon, but Jonathan's team had intercepted her before she could even reach the airport tarmac. Now she stood shrinking against the glass wall, her face drained of all color, clutching her designer purse to her chest like a useless shield. I turned my attention back to the massive conference table, ignoring the terrified murmurs rippling through the room. I directed you to the financial audit, I said, my voice cutting through the stale, panicked air. Now I want you to turn to the very back of those glossy black folders. You will find a single sealed envelope marked with a red tab. Open it. I picked up the master folder resting on the podium. I walked directly up to Richard Weston. He was still staring at the glowing red chart of his financial ruin, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. I slammed the folder down on the glass surface right in front of his hands. "Read it, Richard," I commanded. Richard's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the envelope. He tore the heavy paper open and pulled out the thick watermarked pages of an independent laboratory report. It was a certified genetic paternity analysis expedited and authenticated by a federal judge. The names on the document were clearly printed in bold black ink: Richard Thomas Weston and Carter James Weston. For decades, you have suffocated everyone around you with the myth of the Weston legacy, I said, pacing slowly along the edge of the table as the board members tore into their own envelopes. You destroyed lives, ruined careers, and stepped on the throats of anyone who did not possess your so-called elite bloodline. You built a dynasty on the absolute delusion of your own genetic superiority. Richard's eyes scanned down the page. His breath hitched sharply in his throat. The remaining color vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a fragile, hollow shell of an old man. The paper slipped from his grasp, fluttering down to rest on the glass podium. The bold, undeniable text faced the entire room. Probability of paternity 0.00%, 0% match, I announced loudly, ensuring the words struck every corner of the boardroom. Richard slowly lifted his head. He did not look at me. He turned his neck with agonizing slowness, his gaze locking onto his wife. Patricia pressed her back flat against the wall, trembling violently. A pathetic whimpering sound escaped her lips as she withered under the crushing weight of her husband's stare. Included in your folders is a certified transcript of an audio recording. I continued, gesturing to the board members who were feverishly reading the pages. It is a recording taken yesterday morning in Boston Common. Patricia Weston graciously provided a full, uncoerced confession. Carter is not the heir to the Weston Empire. Carter is the son of your former estate gardener, Richard. Your pure elite bloodline is a total fraud. The silence in the room was absolute. The financial ruin displayed on the projector was catastrophic, but this was a visceral personal destruction. The mighty Richard Weston, a man who believed he was practically royalty, had spent his entire life protecting and grooming a legacy that belonged to a man who pruned his rose bushes. 35 years, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. 35 years of elevating a total fraud while you treated your actual daughter like a disposable pawn. You handed Carter the keys to the kingdom simply because he was born a son, completely blind to the fact that he was never yours to begin with. Carter let out a guttural, terrifying sound. It was half sob, half scream. He lunged forward and grabbed the paternity report off the podium, his eyes manic and wide as he read the numbers. He crumpled the heavy paper in his fist, throwing it violently at my feet. "It is fake!" Carter shrieked, his voice cracking as he backed away from the table. "She is planting fake evidence. Dad, do not listen to her. She is trying to ruin me because I caught her. She is a liar." Carter spun around, facing the stunned shareholders. He was sweating profusely, dark patches blooming through the fabric of his bespoke suit. His face was purple with rage and desperation. He needed a weapon, any weapon, to deflect the absolute crushing humiliation raining down on his head. He looked like a cornered animal preparing to strike. "It doesn't matter!" Carter screamed, pointing a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. "Even if it is true, it changes nothing about her. She is a crazy, cheating whore, trying to steal my birthright. She cheated on me, her precious little boy, the son she claims is the next heir. Leo isn't mine either. She cheated." Carter stood panting, staring wildly at the board members, waiting for their shock, waiting for them to turn their disgust and fury toward me. He believed his accusation was the ultimate shield, the final blow that would discredit my entire audit. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that chilled the air in the room. I felt the absolute, undeniable surge of victory course through my veins. The trap I had spent months meticulously building had perfectly flawlessly snapped shut. I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to meet my gaze. "You're right, Carter," I said, my voice perfectly steady, slicing through his chaotic panic like a blade. "You're not Leo's father." Carter let out a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter. He turned back to Richard, throwing his hands in the air. "You see? She admits it. She is a fraud." I took another step closer, my eyes gleaming with absolute victory. I bypassed Carter entirely and locked my gaze directly on Richard Weston, watching the gears in his mind grind to a horrific, paralyzing halt. "You are not Leo's father," I repeated, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "But Leo is a Weston." The words hung suspended in the chilled air of the boardroom. Carter let out a breathless, mocking scoff, shaking his head, as if trying to dislodge the absolute certainty radiating from my face. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands grasping at the empty air as if searching for something solid to hold on to. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume he had outgrown. "What are you talking about?" Carter spat, his voice devoid of its previous venom, replaced now by a creeping hollow dread. "You are speaking nonsense. You cheated. You slept with someone else and tried to pass the bastard off as mine. You are trying to deflect from your own pathetic sins. I did not sleep with anyone else." "Carter?" I stated, my voice echoing off the glass panes of the 60th floor. "I simply took matters into my own hands when you proved to be entirely inadequate in every possible sense of the word." I raised the master remote and pressed another button. The catastrophic red financial chart vanished from the massive screen behind Richard. In its place, a crisp, stark white document appeared. It bore the unmistakable logo of the Boston Fertility Institute. The text was magnified, impossible to miss, with Carter's name stamped clearly across the top, followed by paragraphs of clinical, devastating medical terminology. I turned to face him, letting my gaze sweep over his trembling frame. "You are completely sterile, Carter. You have been since birth. The doctors confirmed it a year ago when we first began the preliminary testing for in vitro fertilization. But you were too much of a coward to face it. You hid the results. You intercepted the clinic's calls. You let me inject myself with hormones for months, pretending we were trying to build a family, all to protect your fragile, pathetic ego. You let me believe I was the broken one." Carter's face went entirely slack. He stared up at his own medical records, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping. The shareholders murmured, exchanging shocked, disgusted glances. The great air the man supposed to carry on the Weston name was fundamentally incapable of doing so, and he had been perfectly willing to let his wife endure physical and emotional torment to hide his secret. The illusion of his masculinity and power evaporated right in front of the board. Richard, however, was not focused on Carter's medical records. His sharp, predatory mind was already working through the implications of my earlier statement. He stepped away from the podium, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. His face was a terrifying mask of rage and desperate confusion. "If Carter is sterile," Richard growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the murmurs of his investors, "and you claim you did not cheat. Then who is the father of that boy? You said he is a Weston. Explain yourself, Abigail, right now." I turned my attention fully to Richard. I watched the man who had tormented me, who had tried to crush me under the weight of his legacy, stand utterly powerless in his own boardroom. I savored the moment, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. When I discovered Carter's secret, I realized something very important, Richard. I began pacing slowly toward him. My heels clicked rhythmically on the hardwood, setting the tempo for his destruction. I realized that if Carter was not your biological son, and if Carter could not produce an heir, then the Weston family trust, the $500 million you so desperately sought to protect, had a massive gaping loophole. The trust was ironclad in its stipulations. It dictated that the assets must pass to a direct biological descendant of the Weston bloodline. Richard's eyes narrowed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was a man accustomed to being 3 steps ahead, but right now he was plunging into the dark. Where are you going with this? I needed to ensure my child had unquestionable legal rights to that trust. I continued, my voice ringing with clinical precision. I knew you were drowning in debt. I knew Carter was embezzling. I needed a failsafe to protect my son from the toxic burning wreckage of this family. So I visited the fertility clinic. I arranged for an anonymous sperm donation to proceed with the IVF treatments. Only it was not exactly anonymous. Patricia let out a sharp, horrified gasp from her corner, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She knew. She realized exactly what I had done before Richard even processed the words. Her shrill gasp drew the attention of several board members, but my focus remained locked entirely on the patriarch. I hired a private investigator, I said, stepping closer to the head of the table. I tracked down the cryobank used by your family. I paid a very handsome sum to bypass the standard anonymity protocols. The donor I selected was a man who banked his specimens 15 years ago, shortly before undergoing aggressive chemotherapy. A man who tragically passed away 10 years ago. Richard stumbled backward as if I had driven a physical blade into his chest. He hit the edge of the conference table, his hands gripping the mahogany wood so tightly his knuckles turned stark white to keep himself upright. He shook his head violently, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost difficult to witness. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting his own corporate tower. No, Richard choked out, his voice reduced to a ragged, broken whisper. No, you did not do that. You could not possibly have done that. Yes, Richard, I said, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally break across my face. The donor was your younger brother, Thomas. The boardroom descended into absolute pandemonium. The shareholders gasped, some physically recoiling from the table, knocking over chairs in their haste to back away from the epicenter of the drama. Carter let out a high, thin wail of pure despair, dropping to his knees on the plush carpet. He curled into himself, covering his ears, completely broken by the weight of his own insignificance and the horrifying reality of his wife's ultimate checkmate. I stepped right up to Richard, invading his personal space, forcing him to look at the woman who had entirely dismantled his empire piece by piece. Leo is not a bastard, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. Biologically, he is your nephew Richard. He carries the exact DNA you prize above all else. He is the only true Weston heir standing in this room. And because Carter is a legal fraud, and you are a criminal facing a massive federal indictment, the stipulations of your own ironclad trust default entirely to the next of kin. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that only he could hear over the screaming shareholders and the frantic chaos erupting around us. As Leo's mother and sole legal guardian, I now control whatever is left of this miserable company. You have nothing, Richard. No son, no legacy, no empire. You are just an old, ruined man standing in a locked room waiting for the end. Richard's mouth opened to scream, to curse, to unleash whatever remaining fury he possessed, but the sound died in his throat. He looked past me, his eyes glassy and defeated. Piercing the thick, insulated glass of the financial tower, a new sound emerged. It started as a distant wail rising rapidly from the city streets far below. The sound multiplied, growing louder and more urgent by the second. The sharp, frantic shrieks of police sirens cut through the Boston morning air. Blue and red lights began to reflect off the surrounding skyscrapers, an undeniable approaching storm. The authorities had arrived to collect what was left of the Weston family. The wailing sirens of that Boston morning eventually faded, replaced by the steady, mundane hum of a Manhattan diner 6 months later. The smell of cheap coffee and fried grease hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed environment of the Weston Financial Tower. Above the counter, a mounted television screen flashed a breaking news banner. I took a slow sip from my ceramic mug, watching the broadcast with absolute clinical detachment. Carter Weston was on the screen, shuffling out of a federal courthouse. The custom Italian suits and arrogant swagger were entirely gone, replaced by a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. His wrists were secured in heavy iron handcuffs, the chains clinking against his waist as he kept his head bowed to avoid the blinding flashes of the paparazzi. The news anchor's voice was crisp and merciless, announcing his 10-year federal sentence in a maximum security facility for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and systematic embezzlement. There would be no early parole. There were no expensive fixers or high-priced legal teams left to save him. Carter was finally paying the ultimate price for the illusion he had so desperately tried to maintain, his fragile ego permanently locked behind steel bars. The camera panned to a brief clip of the Weston estate being auctioned off by the federal government, which naturally brought my thoughts to Patricia. She was no longer hosting elite charity galas or dripping in generational diamonds. Thrown out on the street, the moment the federal marshals seized every bank account, vehicle, and property, Patricia had plummeted from the very top of the social hierarchy straight into the gutter. She was now working the night shift as a cleaner at a cheap 24-hour laundromat in a rough, forgotten suburb of Boston. I could easily picture her new reality: the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, the overpowering smell of cheap bleach, and the physical toll of scraping grime off the peeling linoleum floors. Her former high society friends, the women she had ruthlessly gossiped with over $1,000 lunches, completely ignored her existence. They would bring their dry cleaning to a premium shop directly across the street, walking right past the laundromat's glass windows and deliberately turning their heads to avoid making eye contact with the disgraced matriarch. She had become entirely invisible. Richard fared even worse. The sheer, overwhelming shock of the boardroom confrontation, the crushing realization that his pure bloodline was a lie and his financial empire was evaporating in real time, had triggered a massive, debilitating stroke right there on the 60th floor. He had collapsed onto the mahogany table before the police had even breached the locked doors. Now completely paralyzed on his right side and stripped of his ability to speak, Richard resided in a low-budget, state-funded nursing home. The federal government had seized every single asset, leaving him with absolutely nothing to afford private care. He spent his days sitting in a vinyl wheelchair, staring blankly at a yellowed wall, trapped inside his own failing, silent mind. He had built his entire life on projecting power and using his voice to intimidate and manipulate the world around him. Now he possessed neither. Caroline had not escaped the devastating fallout. The toxic debt had systematically swallowed her personal trust funds as well. Deep in insurmountable debt and officially divorced by Andre, she had been forced to take a job waitressing at a bustling mid-tier restaurant downtown to survive. The poetic justice of her situation was almost too perfect to articulate. The very same elite circle of friends she used to entertain and seek validation from now sat at her tables. They snapped their manicured fingers at her demanding water refills and aggressively complaining about the service. They treated her with the exact same condescension and casual cruelty she had once inflicted on the world. She was forced to plaster on a submissive smile, swallow her pride, and serve them just to make rent. I placed a crisp $20 bill on the diner counter and stepped out into the vibrant, rushing energy of the Manhattan streets. The air was crisp, tasting of endless opportunity and unbridled freedom. A short walk brought me to a sleek, modern glass high-rise standing tall against the morning sky. I bypassed the lobby security with a familiar nod and took the private elevator straight to the top floor. The polished double doors slid open, revealing a gorgeous, expansive, sunlit corner office boasting panoramic views of the New York City skyline. The gold-plated plaque on the door caught the light perfectly. It read Weston and Hayes Forensic Accounting. Partnering with Andre had been the greatest professional decision of my life. Together we hunted down corporate fraud, dismantling corrupt organizations, and protecting innocent shareholders from the exact type of predatory schemes Richard had built. We had turned the trauma of the past into a highly lucrative, fiercely respected enterprise. I walked into my office, the natural sunlight warming the sleek modern furniture and the polished hardwood floors. In the center of the room, on a plush cream-colored rug, little Leo was happily playing with a set of wooden building blocks. He giggled a bright, pure sound, that instantly filled the room with life and warmth. I dropped my briefcase on the desk and knelt down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the top of his head. He looked up at me with his bright, intelligent eyes. He was completely safe. He was completely secure. I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling metropolis. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee from the carafe on my desk, the rich aroma grounding me in the present moment. I took a slow, satisfying sip, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the millions of lives moving freely below. The Weston family had tried to crush me. They had tried to erase my worth, manipulate my reality, and steal my son's future to feed their toxic, crumbling legacy. But I did not just survive their games. I exposed their lies. I tore their miserable empire down to its very foundations, and I built my own. The wailing sirens of that Boston morning eventually faded, replaced by the steady, mundane hum of a Manhattan diner 6 months later. The smell of cheap coffee and fried grease hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed environment of the Weston Financial Tower. Above the counter, a mounted television screen flashed a breaking news banner. I took a slow sip from my ceramic mug, watching the broadcast with absolute clinical detachment. Carter Weston was on the screen, shuffling out of a federal courthouse. The custom Italian suits and arrogant swagger were entirely gone, replaced by a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. His wrists were secured in heavy iron handcuffs, the chains clinking against his waist as he kept his head bowed to avoid the blinding flashes of the paparazzi. The news anchor's voice was crisp and merciless, announcing his 10-year federal sentence in a maximum security facility for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and systematic embezzlement. There would be no early parole. There were no expensive fixers or high-priced legal teams left to save him. Carter was finally paying the ultimate price for the illusion he had so desperately tried to maintain, his fragile ego permanently locked behind steel bars. The camera panned to a brief clip of the Weston estate being auctioned off by the federal government, which naturally brought my thoughts to Patricia. She was no longer hosting elite charity galas or dripping in generational diamonds. Thrown out on the street the moment the federal marshals seized every bank account, vehicle, and property, Patricia had plummeted from the very top of the social hierarchy straight into the gutter. She was now working the night shift as a cleaner at a cheap 24-hour laundromat in a rough, forgotten suburb of Boston. I could easily picture her new reality: the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, the overpowering smell of cheap bleach, and the physical toll of scraping grime off the peeling linoleum floors. Her former high society friends, the women she had ruthlessly gossiped with over $1,000 lunches, completely ignored her existence. They would bring their dry cleaning to a premium shop directly across the street, walking right past the laundromat's glass windows and deliberately turning their heads to avoid making eye contact with the disgraced matriarch. She had become entirely invisible. Richard fared even worse. The sheer, overwhelming shock of the boardroom confrontation, the crushing realization that his pure bloodline was a lie and his financial empire was evaporating in real time, had triggered a massive, debilitating stroke right there on the 60th floor. He had collapsed onto the mahogany table before the police had even breached the locked doors. Now completely paralyzed on his right side and stripped of his ability to speak, Richard resided in a low-budget, state-funded nursing home. The federal government had seized every single asset, leaving him with absolutely nothing to afford private care. He spent his days sitting in a vinyl wheelchair, staring blankly at a yellowed wall, trapped inside his own failing, silent mind. He had built his entire life on projecting power and using his voice to intimidate and manipulate the world around him. Now he possessed neither. Caroline had not escaped the devastating fallout. The toxic debt had systematically swallowed her personal trust funds as well. Deep in insurmountable debt and officially divorced by Andre, she had been forced to take a job waitressing at a bustling mid-tier restaurant downtown to survive. The poetic justice of her situation was almost too perfect to articulate. The very same elite circle of friends she used to entertain and seek validation from now sat at her tables. They snapped their manicured fingers at her demanding water refills and aggressively complaining about the service. They treated her with the exact same condescension and casual cruelty she had once inflicted on the world. She was forced to plaster on a submissive smile, swallow her pride, and serve them just to make rent. I placed a crisp $20 bill on the diner counter and stepped out into the vibrant, rushing energy of the Manhattan streets. The air was crisp, tasting of endless opportunity and unbridled freedom. A short walk brought me to a sleek, modern glass high-rise, standing tall against the morning sky. I bypassed the lobby security with a familiar nod and took the private elevator straight to the top floor. The polished double doors slid open, revealing a gorgeous, expansive, sunlit corner office, boasting panoramic views of the New York City skyline. The gold-plated plaque on the door caught the light perfectly. It read Weston and Hayes Forensic Accounting. Partnering with Andre had been the greatest professional decision of my life. Together, we hunted down corporate fraud, dismantling corrupt organizations, and protecting innocent shareholders from the exact type of predatory schemes Richard had built. We had turned the trauma of the past into a highly lucrative, fiercely respected enterprise. I walked into my office, the natural sunlight warming the sleek, modern furniture and the polished hardwood floors. In the center of the room, on a plush cream-colored rug, little Leo was happily playing with a set of wooden building blocks. He giggled a bright, pure sound that instantly filled the room with life and warmth. I dropped my briefcase on the desk and knelt down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the top of his head. He looked up at me with his bright, intelligent eyes. He was completely safe. He was completely secure. I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling metropolis. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee from the carafe on my desk, the rich aroma grounding me in the present moment. I took a slow, satisfying sip, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the millions of lives moving freely below. The Weston family had tried to crush me. They had tried to erase my worth, manipulate my reality, and steal my son's future to feed their toxic, crumbling legacy. But I did not just survive their games. I exposed their lies, I tore their miserable empire down to its very foundations, and I built my own.